Picture this. A man so feared that kingdoms negotiate rather than provoke him, standing alone in an empty throne room while servants flee at the sound of his footsteps. Duke Lucien Blackthorn built an empire on ruthlessness, where mercy is weakness and control is survival. But when a woman arrives wearing mourning black and carrying a royal decree that chains her to him through marriage, everything he thought he understood about power begins to crack. This is the story of a monster learning that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't an army at your gates. It's the one person who refuses to fear you. Stay until the end to see how obsession destroys empires, and drop your city in the comments so I know who's watching this descent into chaos with me. The storm came 3 days before she did. Wind tore across the northern cliffs of Ravenspire, like the gods themselves were trying to rip the fortress from its foundation. Lightning split the iron sky. Rain hammered against stone walls that had stood for 400 years, built by men who understood that survival in the north meant becoming harder than the winters that killed the weak. Duke Lucien Blackthorn stood at the highest window of his ancestral castle, watching nature rage against his domain with the same detachment he brought to everything else in his life. The storm would pass. It always did. Just like rebellions, just like rival houses that forgot their place, just like every challenge to his authority that had dissolved beneath the weight of calculated brutality. He was 32 years old and had already buried more enemies than most men met in a lifetime. The castle staff moved through the corridors below like ghosts, their footsteps carefully soft against ancient stone. They had learned over the years that drawing attention in Ravenspire meant inviting scrutiny, and scrutiny from the Duke could cost you everything from your position to your fingers, depending on what he discovered. Lucien's chamberlain, an elderly man named Garrett, who had served House Blackthorn since before Lucien's father died, appeared in the doorway without knocking. He was one of 3 people in the entire kingdom who understood that hesitation annoyed the Duke more than interruption. "Your Grace," the royal messenger arrived during the storm. "He carries a sealed decree from the crown." Lucien didn't turn from the window. "Let him wait until morning." Garrett cleared his throat, a sound that meant he was about to deliver news his employer wouldn't like. "The decree concerns Lady Vale. Her father died last month under circumstances the crown found suspicious. The estate has been seized. She arrives tomorrow." Now Lucien turned. His face was the kind of handsome that made people nervous rather than attracted. All sharp angles and cold gray eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they observed. He stood 6 feet 3 inches of lean muscle built from years of sword training and actual combat, not the decorative fencing nobles performed at court. A scar ran along his left jawline, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, a reminder of a childhood lesson about trust that had nearly killed him. "Why would Vale's daughter arrive here?" Garrett extended a sealed letter bearing the royal crest. "According to the decree, she is to become your wife within 30 days. A political alliance to secure loyalty between the northern territories and the crown's interests in the Vale holdings." Lucien took the letter but didn't open it immediately. His mind was already moving through the implications like a general assessing battlefield terrain. House Vale controlled strategic ports along the eastern coast. The family had maintained careful neutrality during the border rebellion, which meant they either had powerful secrets or powerful allies. Probably both. And now the crown was dropping a Vale daughter into his lap like a gift-wrapped liability. He broke the seal and read in silence. The decree was formal, absolute, and backed by the king's signature. Refusal would be interpreted as disloyalty to the crown. Acceptance would chain him to a woman he'd never met, from a family whose secrets had just gotten her father killed. Lucien looked up at Garrett. "What do we know about her?" "Very little, Your Grace. She's 24. Educated. The court gossip suggests she managed much of House Vale's correspondence after her mother passed. Beyond that, the nobility doesn't discuss her much, which meant she was either unremarkable or very good at being underestimated." Lucien walked to his desk and set the decree down with the kind of precision that made it clear the conversation was over. "Prepare the guest chambers in the East Wing. Inform the household staff that Lady Seraphina is to be treated with the courtesy befitting her station. Nothing more, nothing less." "And the wedding preparations?" Lucien's expression didn't change. "We have 30 days. Use 29 of them to investigate exactly why her father died and who benefits from this arrangement besides the crown. The wedding will happen on the 30th day, not before." Garrett bowed and disappeared into the corridor, leaving Lucien alone with the storm and a future he hadn't chosen, but would control anyway. Because that's what Blackthorns did. They controlled everything, or they destroyed it. Lady Serafina Vale arrived the next afternoon in a carriage so covered in mud that the family crest was barely visible. The storm had turned the northern roads into rivers of freezing sludge, and the journey from the capital had taken 6 days instead of 4. Lucian watched from the castle battlements as her carriage struggled up the final approach to Ravenspire's main gates. Most noblewomen would have sent advance notice, requested accommodations, demanded servants meet them with heated towels and refreshments. She just arrived. The carriage door opened before any footman could reach it, and Serafina stepped down into the mud wearing black mourning clothes that hadn't been expensive to begin with, and definitely weren't designed for northern weather. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid. No jewelry, no attendants, no lady's maid clutching smelling salts and complaining about the journey. Just a woman standing alone in front of the most feared fortress in the kingdom, like she'd come to negotiate terms rather than surrender her future. Lucien studied her from above. She was tall for a woman, maybe 5'8", with the kind of posture that suggested either military training or an extremely strict governess. Her face was composed, unreadable. Even from this distance, he could see she wasn't looking at the castle with awe or fear. She was assessing it, calculating entrances, exits, defensive positions, weaknesses. Interesting. By the time Lucien descended to the Great Hall, the household staff had already brought Serafina inside and were making awkward attempts at hospitality. She stood near the massive fireplace that dominated the center of the room, still wearing her mud-splattered cloak, declining offers of tea and dismissing suggestions that she might want to rest. She was waiting for him. Lucien entered through the main archway with Garrett trailing behind him. The entire hall went quiet. Servants froze mid-step. Minor nobles who'd been lingering near the fire suddenly found reasons to examine the tapestries on the opposite wall. Serafina turned to face him, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Lucien felt something close to surprise. She didn't lower her eyes. Every person in Ravenspire had learned the same survival instinct. When the Duke enters a room, you acknowledge his authority by dropping your gaze. Merchants did it. Ministers did it. Visiting dignitaries from kingdoms twice as powerful as Ravenspire did it, because challenging Lucien Blackthorn's dominance, even symbolically, was the kind of mistake people made once. But Serafina looked directly at him with eyes the color of dark amber, and an expression that suggested she'd already decided he wasn't as dangerous as his reputation claimed. Lady Serafina. Lucien's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Welcome to Ravenspire." "Your Grace." Her voice was steady, educated, carrying none of the trembling deference he'd expected. "Thank you for receiving me on such short notice. The crown didn't leave either of us much choice in the matter." "No." She didn't break eye contact. They rarely do. The servants were staring now, probably wondering if they were about to witness the Duke's legendary temper. Garrett had gone very still, the way he always did before violence. But Lucien found himself more intrigued than angry. He crossed the hall toward her with slow, measured steps. Most people retreated when he moved into their personal space. Serafina held her ground, and when he stopped close enough to see the gold flecks in her eyes, she still didn't flinch. "You understand the terms of the decree?" Lucien asked quietly. "Marriage within 30 days. Political alliance between our houses. Security for the crown's interests in both territories." She paused. "I assume you've already begun investigating my father's death and calculating how to turn this situation to your advantage." Lucien felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but close. "You assume correctly. Then we understand each other, Your Grace. This isn't a love match. It's a transaction. You need the legitimacy my family name provides, and I need the protection of House Blackthorn while I figure out who killed my father and why the crown is so eager to bury the investigation." The hall had gone absolutely silent. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling, because noblewomen didn't speak to Duke Lucien Blackthorn like business partners negotiating contracts. They certainly didn't announce their own agendas in front of his entire household like they expected to be treated as equals. Lucien studied her face, looking for fear, calculation, performance. He found none of it. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman who'd lost everything, been thrown into a nightmare political situation, and decided her best chance of survival was brutal honesty. And somehow, that made her the most dangerous person he'd encountered in years. "Your chambers are prepared in the East Wing," Lucian said finally. "Garrett will show you the way. We'll discuss the details of our arrangement tomorrow after you've rested. I'm not tired." Nevertheless, he gestured toward the corridor. "In this house, Lady Seraphina, you'll find that I don't often repeat myself." For a moment, something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear, exactly. More like recognition. She was seeing him clearly now, understanding that the man beneath the reputation was possibly more dangerous than the legends suggested. But instead of backing down, she smiled, a small, cold expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Then we have that in common as well, Your Grace." She turned and followed Garrett toward the East Wing without waiting for dismissal, leaving Lucien standing alone in his great hall, surrounded by servants who couldn't believe what they'd just witnessed. And for the first time since his father died and left him an empire built on fear, Lucien Blackthorne felt the foundation of his carefully controlled world shift beneath him. Because he'd spent his entire life learning to dominate through intimidation, manipulation, and when necessary, violence. But none of those tools worked on someone who walked into your fortress like they'd rather burn beside you than kneel. The first week passed in careful observation. Lucien had Garrett assign servants to monitor Seraphina's movements, report on her conversations, track every letter she sent and received, standard protocol for any potential threat inside Ravenspire's walls. The reports came back strange. She woke early, before dawn. She spent hours in the castle library reading histories of the Border Rebellion and land charters from House Blackthorne's territorial acquisitions. She walked through the servants' quarters, asking questions about their families, their wages, how long they'd worked in the castle. She attended dinners with visiting nobles and sat quietly listening to political gossip without contributing. And every 3 days she requested an audience with Lucien to discuss the wedding arrangements. He kept refusing, not out of avoidance, but strategy. In Lucien's experience, people revealed more about themselves when they were forced to wait. Impatience led to mistakes. Desperation led to weakness. But Seraphina didn't seem impatient or desperate. She just kept requesting meetings with the same calm persistence, and when he declined, she'd nod politely and return to the library or the gardens or wherever else she'd decided to investigate his territory. On the 8th day, Lucien found her in the castle's rarely used chapel. He hadn't intended to seek her out. He'd been walking the perimeter as he did most nights, checking security, ensuring the guards were alert. The chapel was supposed to be empty. It had been empty for years, ever since his father declared that gods had no place in a house built by men. But candlelight flickered through the stained glass windows, and when Lucien pushed open the heavy wooden doors, he found Seraphina sitting alone in the front pew. She wasn't praying. She was reading through a stack of old ledgers, the kind the castle's steward kept in the archives, documenting household expenses from decades past. Most people would have jumped when the Duke appeared unannounced in a dark chapel. Seraphina just glanced up from her reading like she'd been expecting him. "Your Grace." She closed the ledger carefully. "I didn't realize anyone used this space." "They don't." Lucien moved down the center aisle, boots echoing against stone. "What are you doing?" "Research." She gestured at the ledgers. "Your father ran this territory with remarkable efficiency, minimal waste, maximum control. The household expenses during the Border Rebellion barely increased despite doubling the military forces. You're reading 20-year-old financial records in an abandoned chapel after midnight because you're interested in my father's budget management?" Seraphina looked at him with those unsettling amber eyes. "I'm reading them because the numbers don't match the official histories. According to the Royal Archives, House Blackthorne nearly bankrupted itself during the rebellion, but these ledgers show consistent reserves, strategic investments, careful planning, which means either your father was a better administrator than history credits, or someone wanted the kingdom to believe Ravenspire was weaker than it actually was." Lucien stopped 3 feet from her pew. Most people who started digging into House Blackthorne's secrets during the Border Rebellion ended up finding evidence they wished they hadn't. His father had done things during that war that made Lucien's current reputation look merciful by comparison. "And you think this information is relevant to your father's death?" "I think my father discovered something about the rebellion that someone in the capital couldn't afford to have exposed." She stood, and even in the dim candlelight, Lucien could see the intensity in her expression. 2 weeks before he died, He sent me a letter saying he'd found proof that the royal family profited from the border rebellion by selling weapons to both sides. He said he was bringing the evidence to the king's council. Then he was murdered. Serafina's voice didn't waver. And the crown immediately seized all Vale properties, scattered our household staff, and married me off to the most isolated noble in the kingdom where no one would listen if I started asking dangerous questions. Lucian considered her carefully. She wasn't wrong. The timeline was suspicious. The crown's response had been unusually aggressive for a simple estate dispute. But more importantly, she was standing in his chapel at midnight telling him she planned to investigate a conspiracy that could destabilize the kingdom. And she was doing it like she expected him to help. "You realize what you're suggesting?" Lucian said quietly. "If the crown is involved in your father's death, pursuing this makes you a liability to the throne. And I'm supposed to become your husband in 3 weeks, which makes me responsible for neutralizing that liability." Serafina met his gaze without flinching. "Is that what you're going to do, Your Grace? Neutralize me?" The question hung between them like a blade. Lucien had neutralized threats before. People who challenged his authority, who threatened Ravenspire's security, who made the mistake of thinking his reputation was exaggeration. He'd buried them in unmarked graves or exiled them to territories so remote they might as well be dead. It would be simple, efficient, strategic. But as he looked at Serafina standing defiant in the candlelight, surrounded by evidence of her father's murder and refusing to be intimidated by the most feared man in the north, Lucian felt something shift in his chest. Not mercy, he didn't believe in mercy, but something close to respect. "No," he said finally, "I'm not going to neutralize you." Serafina's expression didn't change, but he saw her shoulders relax fractionally. "Then what are you going to do?" Lucian stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "I'm going to marry you in 3 weeks as the decree commands. I'm going to publicly treat you as my Duchess and the future of House Blackthorn. And while the kingdom watches our wedding and celebrates the political alliance, you and I are going to quietly destroy whoever killed your father. Why? Because your father was right. The crown did profit from the border rebellion. I have the proof in my own archives. And if they were willing to murder a duke to keep that secret buried, they'll eventually decide I'm too dangerous to leave alive as well." He reached out and brushed a strand of dark hair away from her face, the gesture possessive and calculated. "So you see, Lady Serafina, helping you isn't mercy. It's survival. We both have enemies in the capital. We both have secrets that could destroy us. And we're both about to be bound together by royal decree, whether we like it or not." She studied his face for a long moment, and Lucian wondered what she saw. The monster everyone else feared? The ruthless duke who carved an empire from violence? Or something underneath that he'd spent years learning to hide? "Then we have an alliance," she said quietly. "Not a marriage of convenience, an actual partnership." "Don't confuse partnership with equality," Lucien warned. "This is still my territory, my house, my rules." Serafina smiled that cold smile he was beginning to recognize. "Of course, Your Grace. As long as you understand that I don't follow rules I haven't agreed to first." Then she collected her ledgers and walked past him toward the chapel doors, leaving Lucien alone in the candlelight with the uncomfortable realization that for the first time in his carefully controlled life, he'd met someone he couldn't intimidate into submission. And instead of viewing that as a threat to eliminate, he found himself wanting to see exactly how far her defiance would go before it finally broke, which meant the obsession had already begun. He just didn't realize yet that obsession was far more dangerous than any conspiracy. The wedding preparations began in earnest. The castle transformed into organized chaos as servants cleaned rooms that hadn't been opened in decades. Chefs planned menus for the feast. Seamstresses arrived from the capital to create Serafina's wedding gown. Invitations went out to every major house in the kingdom, because refusing to attend Duke Blackthorn's wedding was the kind of insult that led to unfortunate accidents. Lucien handled the politics while Serafina handled the performance. She was good at it, he discovered, better than he'd expected. She moved through pre-wedding social events with the grace of someone who'd spent years navigating dangerous court situations, always saying exactly enough to be polite without revealing anything meaningful. Noblewomen who'd expected to find her intimidated or broken were surprised to discover she held conversations about economics, military strategy, and territorial law with the confidence of someone who'd actually studied those subjects. and when visiting nobles made the mistake of condescending to her, she smiled pleasantly and verbally dismantled them with observations so cutting that Lucien found himself watching from across ballrooms just to see who would underestimate her next. But at night, after the social performances ended, they met in Lucien's private study to plan their real agenda. The evidence they'd assembled was damning. Serafina's father had been right. During the border rebellion, the crown had secretly sold weapons to both the northern territories and the rebel forces, prolonging the war while profiting from the casualties. The current king had been a prince then, overseeing the royal armories. He'd personally authorized shipments that killed thousands of his own soldiers, and when Duke Vale discovered the paper trail, he'd been eliminated. Now the question was what to do with the information without getting themselves killed in the process. "We can't take this directly to the king's council," Serafina said one night, spreading documents across Lucien's desk. "Half the council was complicit. They'll bury it again." Lucien studied the evidence with the same tactical focus he brought to battlefield strategy. "We leak it through neutral parties, merchants' guilds, foreign ambassadors, anyone with no direct loyalty to the crown. Create enough noise that the council can't ignore it without looking guilty. That's a civil war waiting to happen, only if we're careless." Lucien looked up from the documents. "The goal isn't to destroy the crown. It's to force them into a position where protecting us becomes more valuable than eliminating us. Mutually assured destruction." Serafina leaned back in her chair, and Lucien caught himself noticing the way candlelight caught in her dark hair. "You're talking about blackmail. I'm talking about survival." He stood and moved to the window overlooking Ravenspire's grounds. "The kingdom thinks I'm a monster, Lady Serafina. They're not wrong. I've done things that would horrify you if you knew the details. But I've survived this long because I understand that power isn't about being the strongest. It's about being too dangerous to eliminate. And you think making me equally dangerous protects both of us. I think turning you into my Duchess, publicly tying House Blackthorn's future to yours, makes you untouchable. The crown can't move against you without moving against me. And they won't risk open war with Ravenspire unless they're absolutely certain they can win." Serafina was quiet for a moment, then, "You could have just married me and kept the evidence for yourself. Why bring me into the conspiracy?" Lucien turned to face her, and for a moment he considered lying, creating some strategic explanation that maintained his reputation for ruthless self-interest. But instead, he told the truth. "Because the first night you arrived, you stood in my great hall and looked at me like you'd already decided I wasn't the monster everyone warned you about. And I realized I'm tired of being surrounded by people who fear me too much to tell me when I'm wrong. That's not a reason to trust me with dangerous secrets." "No." Lucien crossed the room and stopped in front of her chair. "But it's a reason to find out if there's someone in this kingdom capable of standing beside me instead of behind me." Serafina stood slowly, and suddenly they were close enough that Lucien could see her pulse beating at her throat. "Is that what you want, Your Grace? A partner?" His hand moved to her waist, pulling her against him with the possessive certainty of someone claiming something they'd already decided belonged to them. "I want someone who won't break when this kingdom tries to destroy us. I want someone smart enough to survive the games nobles play and ruthless enough to fight back. I want—" He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, because what he wanted was becoming dangerously close to need, and need was weakness. But Serafina finished it for him anyway, her voice quiet in the candlelit study. "You want someone who scares you as much as you scare them." Lucien's grip tightened fractionally. Then she reached up and touched his scarred jaw with careful fingers, and he realized with sudden clarity that she understood exactly what was happening between them. The obsession wasn't one-sided. She felt it too. The door to the study burst open without warning, and Garrett stumbled in with blood running down his face and terror in his eyes. "Your Grace, we're under attack." Lucien released Serafina and had his sword drawn before Garrett finished speaking. "What forces?" "Mercenaries. At least 50. They breached the south wall during the guard change. The captain thinks it's an assassination attempt." Serafina grabbed a dagger from Lucien's desk with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to use it. "They're coming for me. Or both of us." Lucien moved toward the door, his mind already calculating defensive positions, exit routes, targets. "Garrett, secure the east wing. Get the household staff into the underground passages." The old chamberlain was already moving. "And Lady Serafina?" Lucien looked back at the woman who was supposed to become his wife in less than 2 weeks. standing in his study holding a stolen blade like she'd been preparing for this moment since the day she arrived. Stays with me. Because if someone wanted her dead, they'd have to go through the most dangerous man in Ravenspire first. And Lucian Blackthorn had never lost a fight he was willing to kill for. The distant sound of steel on steel echoed through the castle corridors, and the conspiracy that had murdered Seraphina's father had just made its first direct move against House Blackthorn, which meant the war neither of them wanted had officially begun. The first assassin died before he made it past the study door. Lucian's sword took him through the throat in a movement so fast, Seraphina barely registered it happening. The body hit the floor, spraying arterial blood across ancient stone, and the Duke was already moving toward the corridor with the kind of fluid precision that came from killing often enough that it became reflex rather than thought. "Stay behind me." His voice carried the flat authority of someone who expected absolute obedience during combat. "If I go down, run for the East Passage. Garrett knows where to take you." Seraphina gripped the dagger tighter and followed him into chaos. The castle had transformed into a war zone. Servants screamed somewhere in the lower levels. Steel clashed against steel in the great hall. Smoke poured through ventilation shafts carrying the acrid smell of burning tapestries. The mercenaries had come prepared for siege tactics, coordinated strikes, maximum casualties in minimum time. Someone had paid them extremely well. Lucian moved through the corridors like death incarnate. He killed the second assassin with a blade through the ribs. The third lost his sword hand before Lucian's follow-through opened his stomach. The fourth tried to run and made it 3 steps before the Duke's throwing knife caught him between the shoulder blades. Seraphina had seen violence before. Court politics was violence dressed in silk and served with wine. But watching Lucian Blackthorn fight was witnessing something different entirely. This wasn't rage or cruelty, it was efficiency. The brutal mathematics of survival where hesitation meant death and mercy was a luxury that got you killed. And somewhere beneath her terror, she felt something close to recognition. This was who the Duke actually was when you stripped away the political theater. Not a monster pretending to be civilized. A predator who'd learned to wear civilization like armor because it served his purposes, but underneath remained exactly what the North had made him. Something built to endure winters that killed everything soft. They reached the main staircase and found Captain Morris holding the upper landing with 6 guards. The captain's face was grim beneath his helmet, blood running from a gash across his forehead. "Your Grace, they've taken the armory in the south courtyard. We're holding the great hall, but they keep coming." He glanced at Seraphina. "This wasn't random. They knew our patrol schedules, our defensive positions, everything. Inside help," Lucian said quietly. "We'll deal with that later. Right now I need a head count. How many are we facing?" "At least 40 still active." Morris wiped blood from his eyes. "Professional mercenaries, not common thugs. Someone funded this properly." Lucian's jaw tightened fractionally, the only sign of emotion crossing his face. "Pull everyone back to the Great Hall. Defensible position, limited entry points. We hold there until dawn. And if they breach the hall," the Duke's expression went cold enough to freeze blood. "Then we find out how much they're actually getting paid, because I guarantee it's not enough to die fighting Blackthorn guards on Blackthorn ground." Morris saluted and started barking orders. His remaining guards moved to execute the retreat with the practiced discipline of men who'd served under Lucian long enough to trust his tactical judgment, even when it looked like suicide. Seraphina stayed close to Lucian as they descended toward the Great Hall. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Adrenaline made everything sharp and immediate. She'd never been in actual combat before, never killed anyone, never had to make the choice between someone else's life and her own survival. But as they rounded the corner and found 3 mercenaries trying to break through the hall's rear entrance, Seraphina discovered exactly what choice she'd make. One of them spotted her and grinned. "The Vale girl. Bonus pay if we bring her back breathing." Lucian moved to intercept, but the second mercenary was faster, getting between them with a sword already swinging. The Duke blocked, but the impact drove him back 3 steps, creating space. The first mercenary lunged at Seraphina. She didn't think, just reacted on pure survival instinct, stepping inside his reach the way her father's old weapons master had taught her during those childhood lessons she'd thought were pointless noble affectation. The dagger went up under his ribs, angled toward the heart, exactly like the diagram showed. He made a wet choking sound and collapsed. Seraphina stared at the blade still buried in his chest, at her hand covered in blood that was already cooling, at the reality of what she'd just done crystallizing in her mind with terrible clarity. She'd killed someone. Not in self-defense abstraction, but in actual literal fact. Took a weapon and ended a human life and would carry that weight forever. Serafina. Lucien's voice cut through the shock. Look at me. She dragged her eyes away from the body. The Duke had already killed the other two mercenaries and was watching her with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy, but held something close to understanding. You did what you had to do. That's survival, not murder. Understand? She nodded because speaking seemed impossible. Good. He pulled the dagger from the corpse and wiped it clean before handing it back to her. Now do it again if you have to, because this isn't over. They made it to the great hall where Morris had consolidated the defense. 20 guards formed a perimeter around the main entrances. Household staff huddled near the massive fireplace, clutching kitchen knives and iron pokers. The wounded lay against the far wall, receiving what medical attention was available. Garrett appeared from the servant passages, covered in soot but uninjured. Your Grace, I've sealed the underground routes and stationed guards at the chapel exit. If they breach the hall, we can evacuate the non-combatants. Lucien scanned the room with tactical assessment. How many casualties? 12 dead. 8 wounded, seriously enough they're out of the fight. The old Chamberlain's voice stayed steady despite the chaos. We're holding, but we can't sustain this much longer. Then we end it now. Lucien turned to Morris. Send runners to the mercenary positions. Tell them Duke Blackthorn requests parley. The captain looked skeptical. Your Grace, mercenaries don't honor parley. They'll see it as weakness. They'll see it as an opportunity to negotiate better terms than dying in my castle. Lucien's tone carried absolute certainty. And while their commander is deciding whether to trust me, we're going to kill every one of his men still inside these walls. Serafina understood the strategy immediately. Split their forces, create confusion, exploit the moment of hesitation that came from unexpected offers during violent situations. It was brilliant and ruthless, and exactly the kind of tactical thinking that had made Lucien Blackthorn the most feared military commander in the kingdom before he inherited his father's title. Morris dispatched the runners while Lucien gathered his senior guards and outlined the actual plan. Serafina listened from nearby, watching the Duke transform from the man who'd held her in his study an hour ago into the battlefield commander who'd won the Border Rebellion's most brutal campaigns. This was the monster everyone feared, but she'd seen the other side now. Knew that underneath the calculated violence lived someone who'd offered partnership instead of domination, who'd trusted her with dangerous secrets, who'd put himself between her and assassins without hesitation. And that made him infinitely more dangerous than any simple monster. The parley runner returned 15 minutes later with a response. The mercenary commander wanted to meet at the main courtyard under truce terms. Lucien went alone. Serafina tried to protest, but he shut her down with a look that reminded her exactly who held authority in Ravenspire, regardless of their private agreements. You stay here where Morris can protect you. This isn't negotiation. Then what is it? The Duke checked his sword and smiled without warmth. Reconnaissance. I need to see their commander's face when I make my offer. That will tell me who hired them. He disappeared into the smoke-filled corridors before she could argue further. The weight was suffocating. Serafina stood near the Great Hall's main entrance, watching the doorway while her mind conjured every possible disaster. Lucien ambushed during the approach. The parley revealed as a trap, a crossbow bolt from the shadows ending everything before the conspiracy could be exposed. She realized with uncomfortable clarity that the thought of him dying bothered her far more than it should for a political arrangement barely 2 weeks old. Partnership. That's what he'd called it. But what she felt watching him walk into danger was something closer to the obsessive need she'd seen in his eyes when he touched her. Like somewhere during late-night strategy sessions and shared secrets, the carefully maintained emotional distance had collapsed into something neither of them had planned. You care about him. Garrett appeared beside her with the quiet observation of someone who'd watched nobles long enough to read their tells. Unusual for an arranged marriage. I care about surviving the conspiracy that killed my father. Serafina kept her eyes on the doorway. The Duke is my best chance at that. Of course, my lady. The old Chamberlain's tone suggested he didn't believe a word, though I should mention that His Grace has survived 2 assassination attempts, 3 poisoning plots, and a full military siege since inheriting his title. Whatever emotions you're experiencing, betting against his survival is generally unwise. Before Serafina could respond, Lucien strode back through the doorway, covered in fresh blood and wearing an expression of cold fury that made the temperature in the hall seem to drop 10 degrees. Everyone not wounded or dead, meets in the war room. Now. Morris and the senior guards followed immediately. Serafina went with them because she'd already decided that waiting for permission was a waste of time when the conspiracy was actively trying to murder them both. The war room occupied the castle's central tower with maps covering every wall and a tactical table dominating the center. Lucien stood at the table's head, radiating barely controlled violence while guards filed in and sealed the doors. The mercenary commander confirmed what we suspected. Lucien's voice cut through the assembled soldiers like a blade. This attack was funded by someone in the capital with access to our security protocols and internal schedules. They paid premium rates for my death and Lady Serafina's capture alive. Gasps rippled through the room. An attack on a duke was treason. An attack coordinated with inside information meant someone in Ravenspire had betrayed House Blackthorn. Captain Morris stepped forward. Your Grace, we need to identify the traitor before they can report back or sabotage our defenses further. Already done. Lucien gestured to two guards by the door. Bring him in. They dragged in Lord Ashford, a minor noble who'd served as Ravenspire's chief steward for nearly a decade. The man's face was bruised and bleeding, his expensive clothes torn. He looked terrified. Lucien circled him slowly like a wolf assessing wounded prey. Lord Ashford has been accepting payments from Crown agents for the past 6 months in exchange for intelligence about Ravenspire's operations. He provided the security schedules that allowed tonight's attack. The steward was shaking. Your Grace, please. I can explain. You already did. During our conversation in the courtyard, while your mercenary friends bled out around you. Lucien stopped in front of him. You told me everything I needed to know about who wants me dead and why they're so desperate to capture Lady Serafina. Serafina's pulse quickened. Who hired them? The Duke's eyes never left Ashford, Prince Adrian Valmont, the king's nephew. He's been building a faction in the capital that wants to eliminate House Blackthorn as a political threat and consolidate power under Crown loyalists. The room went silent. Because Prince Adrian was third in line for the throne, commanded significant military forces, and had enough political influence to make accusations of treason stick if he moved carefully. And he just tried to assassinate a duke. Morris found his voice first. Your Grace, if Prince Adrian is involved, this goes beyond simple conspiracy. He's positioning for a power play against the throne itself. Obviously. Lucien's tone was flat, which means we can't go to the King's Council without proof that won't be buried or dismissed. We need leverage that forces Adrian into a position where attacking us becomes more dangerous than leaving us alone. Serafina stepped forward. What did you do with the mercenary commander? Made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Lucien glanced at her. He's currently riding to the capital with a message for Prince Adrian explaining that Duke Blackthorn knows about the conspiracy, has evidence of Crown involvement in the Border Rebellion weapons sales, and is willing to negotiate terms rather than expose everything publicly. You're giving Adrian a chance to back down? I'm giving him a chance to make a mistake. The Duke turned back to Ashford, because desperate men do stupid things when they think they're cornered. And when Prince Adrian makes his next move, we'll be ready to destroy him. The steward was crying now. Your Grace, mercy. I was only... Lucien drew his sword in one smooth motion and drove it through Ashford's chest before the man could finish begging. The body hit the floor. Blood pooled across ancient stone. The guards didn't even flinch because they'd seen the Duke execute traitors before and knew better than to show weakness. But Serafina felt something cold settle in her stomach, watching Lucien clean his blade with the same casual efficiency he'd shown killing the assassins earlier. This was the reality of survival in his world. Betrayal cost blood. Mercy was weakness. Violence was the language of power. And she just allied herself completely with a man who killed without hesitation when it served his purposes. Lucien looked up and caught her expression. You think that was excessive. It wasn't a question. I think it was necessary. Serafina kept her voice steady. Traitors can't be allowed to survive, or it invites more betrayal. Exactly. He sheathed his sword, which is why everyone in this room needs to understand something very clearly. Lady Serafina is under my personal protection. Anyone who threatens her threatens House Blackthorn, and I will burn the kingdom to ash before I allow what happened to her father to happen again. The declaration hung in the air with the weight of absolute authority. And Serafina realized that somewhere during the chaos and violence and conspiracy, Lucien Blackthorn's obsessive need to control everything in his territory had extended completely to include her. Not as property to be owned, as something far more dangerous, something he'd decided was worth protecting, even if it meant going to war with the crown itself. The guards dispersed to handle cleanup and reset security. Garrett began organizing the household staff. Morris took a squad to secure the perimeter and ensure no mercenaries remained hidden in the castle. Lucien caught Serafina's wrist before she could leave the war room. "You need to understand what you've become part of." His voice was quiet but intense. "This isn't political maneuvering anymore. Prince Adrian just declared war on House Blackthorn. When he realizes his mercenaries failed and his messenger delivered my ultimatum, he'll have two choices: negotiate or escalate. And you think he'll escalate? Men like Adrian don't back down when challenged. They double down, which means the next attack won't be mercenaries in the night. It will be public accusations, legal maneuvering, political isolation designed to make me look like a threat to the kingdom that needs to be eliminated for the greater good." Serafina pulled her wrist free. "Then we expose the conspiracy first, release the evidence about the weapon sales during the border rebellion, turn public opinion against the crown before Adrian can weaponize it against us." Lucien shook his head. "That destroys the kingdom's faith in the monarchy, creates instability that could lead to actual civil war. Thousands dead, territories burned, everything my father fought to prevent during the rebellion. So we're supposed to just wait for Adrian to move against us? We're supposed to be smarter than our enemies." The Duke moved closer, crowding into her space with that possessive intensity she was beginning to recognize. "We use the evidence as leverage to force negotiations. Make Adrian understand that destroying us costs him more than leaving us alone. Create a stalemate where both sides survive because mutual destruction benefits no one. That's not justice for my father. No." Lucien's hand came up to cup her jaw, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "It's not. But it's survival. And right now, staying alive long enough to see our enemies fall is more important than revenge." Serafina should have pulled away, should have reminded him that political alliances didn't include intimate touches or possessive declarations, or the kind of intensity burning in his gray eyes. But instead, she leaned into his hand and made the choice that would change everything. "Then we survive. Together. And when the opportunity comes to make them pay for what they did, we take it without hesitation." Lucien's expression shifted into something predatory and satisfied, like she'd just confirmed everything he'd suspected about her capacity for ruthlessness. "Good." He leaned down until his forehead rested against hers. "Because I need you to be willing to do terrible things, Serafina. The world we're fighting against doesn't reward mercy or hesitation. It only respects power and the willingness to use it. I killed a man tonight." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm not afraid of doing what's necessary." "I know." His thumb traced her lower lip. "That's why you're still breathing." The implication was clear. If she'd been weak, if she'd broken during the attack, if she'd proven herself a liability instead of an asset, Lucien would have found a way to neutralize her just like he'd neutralized Ashford, because the Duke didn't keep people around who couldn't survive his world. But she had survived, had killed without hesitation, had stood beside him during the violence, had proven herself capable of the ruthless calculations that his life demanded. And now he was looking at her like she'd become something essential rather than merely useful. "The wedding is in 12 days, Lucien said quietly. "After tonight, the entire kingdom will know we're targets. Every noble house will be watching to see if we survive long enough to actually complete the marriage. Let them watch." Serafina met his eyes. "We'll give them exactly the performance they expect. The feared Duke and his new Duchess consolidating power through a political alliance. And in private? In private, we destroy everyone who tried to kill us tonight and make sure the conspiracy against House Blackthorn dies with them." Lucien smiled then, and it was the kind of expression that made Serafina understand why people feared him. Not because he was cruel, but because he was utterly committed to survival, no matter what it cost. "You're going to be a terrifying Duchess. Good." She pulled back enough to look at him properly. "Because this kingdom seems to only respect people who scare them." They stood in the war room surrounded by maps of territories Lucien controlled, and blood from the traitor he'd executed, and Serafina felt the foundation of her carefully planned future crack apart. She'd come to Ravenspire planning to use the Duke's protection while she investigated her father's murder. A transaction. A temporary alliance that would end once she had justice. But somewhere between late-night strategy sessions and shared conspiracies and watching him fight to keep her alive, The transaction had transformed into something obsessive and consuming and infinitely more dangerous than any political arrangement. She didn't just need Lucian Blackthorn's protection anymore. She wanted his ruthless certainty, his absolute commitment, his willingness to burn everything down rather than accept defeat. Wanted him with an intensity that should have terrified her, but instead felt like finally finding someone who understood that survival sometimes required becoming the monster everyone feared. And that realization was more dangerous than any assassination attempt, because obsession made you vulnerable in ways violence never could. The next morning dawned gray and cold over Ravenspire. The castle staff worked in grim silence, cleaning blood from stone floors and repairing damage from the attack. Mercenary bodies were loaded onto carts for burial in unmarked graves. The 12 guards who died defending the castle received proper honors in the family cemetery. Lucien stood at Lord Ashford's funeral with the cold formality expected of a duke mourning a fallen steward. The official story was that Ashford had died heroically defending against the mercenary attack. Only those present in the war room knew the truth. Politics required certain performances. Serafina attended the funeral in black mourning clothes that reminded everyone present she was still grieving her father. The assembled nobles watched her with renewed speculation. Some whispered that the attack proved House Blackthorn was too dangerous for political alliance. Others suggested the mercenaries had been after Serafina specifically, and the Duke was collateral damage. Let them whisper. Lucien had taught her that rumors were useful when controlled and irrelevant when you held actual power. After the funeral, a messenger arrived from the capital carrying Prince Adrian's official response to Lucien's ultimatum. The Duke read it in his study with Serafina present. The letter was carefully worded, full of diplomatic language and veiled threats. Adrian denied any knowledge of the mercenary attack while simultaneously suggesting that Duke Blackthorn's increasingly isolated position made him vulnerable to enemies from many quarters. Then came the final paragraph that made Lucien's expression go dangerously cold. Prince Adrian formally requested that Lady Serafina Vale travel to the capital for questioning regarding her father's estate and the circumstances of his death. The request was backed by royal authority and suggested that refusing would be interpreted as House Blackthorn obstructing crown justice. Serafina felt ice form in her chest. He's trying to separate us. Obviously, Lucien set the letter down with controlled precision. The attack failed, so now he's using legal maneuvering. If you go to the capital, you'll never make it back. Convenient accident, mysterious illness, something that looks natural but gets you eliminated. And if I refuse? Then Adrian accuses House Blackthorn of harboring fugitives and uses it as justification for military intervention. He gets his war either way. So we're trapped. No. Lucien stood and moved to the window overlooking Ravenspire's grounds. We're being forced into the open, which means it's time to stop playing defense. What are you suggesting? The Duke turned to face her with an expression of absolute certainty. We move the wedding up, tomorrow, before Adrian can make his next move. We complete the alliance publicly with every major house as witness. Once you're legally my wife, the Duchess of Ravenspire, Adrian can't touch you without directly attacking House Blackthorn. Tomorrow? Serafina's mind raced. That's not enough time for political theater. Lucien crossed the room toward her, for elaborate ceremonies and carefully orchestrated performances. You're right, but we don't need theater. We need legal protection and witnesses who can confirm the marriage is legitimate. He stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Marry me tomorrow, Serafina. Not because the crown commanded it, or because our houses need alliance. Marry me because we're both smart enough to know that together, we're far more dangerous than anything Adrian can throw against us. This wasn't romantic. Wasn't the kind of proposal noble women dreamed about during childhood. This was survival dressed up as partnership, with obsession and mutual need buried beneath tactical necessity. And Serafina realized she didn't want romance anyway. She wanted exactly this. The ruthless certainty, the absolute commitment, the willingness to upend every convention if it meant winning. Yes, she held his gaze. Tomorrow. But after we're married, we stop waiting for Adrian to make mistakes. We go on the offensive. Lucien's hand came up to cup the back of her neck, pulling her against him with possessive intensity. What did you have in mind? We leak the evidence about the border rebellion weapon sales, not to the King's Council where it can be buried, to the merchants' guilds, the foreign ambassadors, the noble houses Adrian doesn't control. Her Create enough noise that he has to respond publicly. That's risky. Once that information is out, we can't control how it spreads. Good. Serafina's voice was steady despite her racing heart. Let Adrian try to manage a conspiracy scandal while also trying to destroy us. Force him to fight on multiple fronts. Make him spread his resources so thin that he becomes vulnerable. Lucian studied her face for a long moment. Then he smiled with genuine approval. You really are going to be a terrifying Duchess. He kissed her then, and it wasn't gentle or exploratory or any of the things a first kiss was supposed to be. It was claiming and possessive and carried the weight of everything they'd become to each other during 2 weeks of conspiracy and violence. When Lucien finally pulled back, his expression had shifted into something darker and more intense. Tomorrow, you become mine. Legally, politically, completely. And I want you to understand what that means. I don't share Serafina. I don't compromise on things I've decided belong to me. Once we're married, you're part of House Blackthorn in every sense. My protection, my authority, my obsession. The words should have felt like a threat. Instead, they felt like the first honest thing anyone had said to her since her father died. Because Lucien wasn't pretending this was anything except what it actually was. Mutual possession dressed up as partnership, with both of them too ruthless and damaged to want anything softer. I understand. She reached up and touched his scarred jaw. And I expect the same commitment in return. You're mine just as much as I'm yours. That means no political marriages, no strategic concubines, nothing that undermines what we're building together. Agreed. His hand tightened on her neck. We bind ourselves to each other completely. One alliance, one purpose, one absolutely ruthless commitment to survival. Then tomorrow. Serafina felt something settle in her chest that was equal parts terror and certainty. We become exactly what this kingdom fears most. A partnership of monsters who understand that power only respects greater power. Lucien kissed her again, sealing the agreement with possessive intensity, and Serafina knew with absolute clarity that she'd just crossed a line there was no returning from. Because tomorrow she would marry the most feared man in the kingdom. And together, they would either survive the conspiracy trying to destroy them, or burn the entire kingdom down in the attempt. There was no middle ground anymore. Only victory or annihilation. And Serafina Vale had learned enough from watching her father die to know exactly which option she'd choose when the moment came. The wedding preparations began immediately with the desperate efficiency of people who understood they were racing against political disaster. Garrett mobilized the entire household staff. Messengers rode through the night carrying invitations to every major house within 2 days' travel. The castle's private chapel was cleaned and prepared for a ceremony that would either save House Blackthorn or mark its final defiance before destruction. Serafina spent the evening reviewing documents with Lucien in his study. They were finalizing which pieces of evidence to leak, which merchants' guilds to contact, which foreign ambassadors could be trusted to spread the conspiracy without immediately reporting back to the crown. It was strategic planning dressed up as wedding preparation, and it felt more intimate than anything involving actual romance. Around midnight, Garrett knocked and entered without waiting. "Your Grace, we have a problem. Lord Brennan just arrived from the capital with his entire household guard. He's requesting immediate audience." Lord Brennan was one of the king's senior advisors and Prince Adrian's primary political rival. His unexpected arrival 12 hours before the wedding wasn't coincidence. "Show him to the formal receiving room." Lucien stood and checked his weapons with automatic precision. "And have more station guards at every entrance. You think Brennan is part of the conspiracy?" Serafina asked. "I think anyone arriving unannounced during a crisis is either an ally revealing themselves or an enemy making a final move." The Duke glanced at her. "Either way, we find out now." They met Lord Brennan in the receiving room with enough guards present to handle violence if it came to that. The older nobleman looked exhausted from travel, his expensive clothes dusty from hard riding. "Your Grace?" Brennan bowed formally to Lucien, then turned to Serafina. "Lady Vale, I apologize for the dramatic arrival, but circumstances require urgency." "Explain." Lucien's tone was flat. "Prince Adrian is planning to move against House Blackthorn within the next 72 hours. He's been building support among Crown loyalists by claiming you're preparing to rebel against royal authority. The evidence he's using includes reports of mercenary activity in Ravenspire, which he's spinning as your forces rather than attackers. The bastard attacked us, then blamed us for the violence. Serafina felt cold rage settle in her chest. Brennan nodded. Precisely. And he has enough political support that the King's Council is seriously considering authorizing military intervention. They're calling it preemptive peacekeeping. Lucien's expression didn't change, but Serafina saw his hand move fractionally toward his sword. How long do we have? 3 days at most before the Crown formally accuses you of treason. Brennan met the Duke's eyes, which is why I rode through the night to deliver a proposition. I have evidence that Prince Adrian orchestrated the weapons sales during the border rebellion for his own profit, not the Crown's. Evidence that would destroy his reputation and likely see him exiled or executed for treason. What do you want in return? Lucien asked, because favors in this world always came with prices. An alliance. Brennan's voice was steady. You marry Lady Serafina and establish House Blackthorn as a legitimate power base separate from Crown control. I provide the evidence to neutralize Adrian. Together we create a political coalition strong enough to check the Crown's authority without triggering civil war. You want to use us as a counterbalance to royal power. I want to prevent this kingdom from sliding into tyranny. The old lord's tone was sharp. Prince Adrian represents everything dangerous about unchecked authority. If he consolidates power, he'll turn this kingdom into a military dictatorship. You're ruthless, Your Grace, but you're not insane. That makes you the better option. Serafina watched Lucien process the offer. It was exactly what they needed. Powerful political allies, evidence to destroy Adrian, legitimacy for their position. But it also meant binding themselves to someone else's agenda. What guarantees do we have? Lucien asked. That you won't use this alliance to control House Blackthorn the same way Adrian wants to eliminate it. Mutual interest. Brennan spread his hands. I'm 63 years old with no heirs and no interest in territorial conquest. I want to preserve the kingdom's stability and retire with my reputation intact. You want to survive and maintain your northern territories. Our goals align without competing. Show us the evidence. Brennan produced a leather document case and laid out papers across the receiving room table. Financial records, signed orders, correspondence between Prince Adrian and weapons merchants during the border rebellion. Everything meticulously documented and authenticated. It was everything they needed to destroy Adrian publicly. Lucien studied the documents in silence. Then he looked at Serafina with an expression that asked a question without words. She understood immediately. This was the decision point. Accept Brennan's alliance and gain the power to win, or maintain independence and risk losing everything. Partnership meant trust, and trust was the most dangerous thing in their world. But Serafina had already learned that survival sometimes required gambling on dangerous allies. She nodded. Lucien turned back to Brennan. We accept your terms. You provide this evidence the moment Adrian makes his move against us. In return, House Blackthorn joins your political coalition and supports your position in the King's Council. Agreed. Brennan extended his hand. And to demonstrate good faith, I'll attend your wedding tomorrow as witness. My presence will make it clear to the capital that you have powerful allies. They shook on it while guards watched, and Serafina felt the weight of irrevocable choices settling into her bones. Tomorrow she would marry Lucien Blackthorn. Tomorrow they would publicly bind themselves together before witnesses who would carry word back to the capital. Tomorrow Prince Adrian would learn that his conspiracy had just become exponentially more difficult to execute. And there would be no returning from that moment. The point of no return was 12 hours away. And Serafina Vale stood in Ravenspire Castle beside the man who'd become her partner in survival, and felt nothing but cold certainty that they would either destroy their enemies or die trying, because mercy was weakness. Hesitation was death. And the only thing that mattered now was winning, no matter what it cost. Dawn broke over Ravenspire with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything sharp and immediate. The wedding was scheduled for noon, giving them 6 hours to finalize security, confirm witnesses, and prepare for the moment that would either save them or mark them as targets for the entire kingdom. Serafina stood in her chambers while seamstresses made final adjustments to the wedding gown they'd assembled overnight. It wasn't the elaborate creation she'd imagined as a girl. No intricate beadwork or layers of silk. Just simple white fabric that fell in clean lines, elegant enough for a duchess, but practical enough to move in if violence erupted during the ceremony. Because violence was always a possibility in Lucien's world. She'd learned that lesson watching him kill Lord Ashford, without hesitation. Watching him carve through mercenaries like death incarnate. Watching him negotiate alliances with the cold precision of someone who understood that survival meant being willing to sacrifice anything except victory itself. And in 12 hours, she would legally bind herself to that reality. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like finally understanding the rules of a game she'd been playing blind since her father died. Your Grace, one of the senior maids entered with a sealed letter. This arrived from Lord Brennan. He requests you read it immediately before the ceremony. Serafina broke the seal and read quickly. Brennan's message was brief and concerning. He'd received intelligence that Prince Adrian knew about their accelerated wedding timeline and was preparing a response. Details were unclear, but the tone suggested immediate danger. She needed to find Lucien. The Duke was in the armory with Captain Morris, reviewing security protocols for the ceremony. Guards would be stationed at every entrance to the chapel. Trusted household staff would form a perimeter around the witnesses. Anyone attempting to enter without explicit invitation would be detained and questioned. It was wedding preparation treated like battlefield tactics. Lucien looked up when Serafina entered, and something in her expression made him dismiss Morris immediately. What happened? She handed him Brennan's letter. He read it in silence, his face showing no emotion, but she saw his hand tighten fractionally on the paper. Adrian knows we moved the timeline. Lucien set the letter down with controlled precision, which means someone told him, someone close enough to know our plans. The implication hung between them like a blade. They had a traitor inside Ravenspire. Again. Serafina felt cold certainty settle in her chest. Who knew about the wedding date change? Senior household staff, the guards, Lord Brennan and his retinue. Lucien's voice was flat. And us. That's maybe 40 people total, 40 suspects. Too many to investigate before the ceremony, but too few to ignore. We continue as planned. Lucien moved to check his weapons with automatic precision, double the guards, restrict access to essential personnel only, and assume everyone is compromised until proven otherwise. That's going to make for a warm wedding atmosphere. He looked at her with those cold gray eyes. Would you rather have atmosphere or survival? Survival. Always survival. She'd learned that lesson bleeding in the Great Hall while corpses cooled around her. Good. Lucien crossed to where she stood and cupped her jaw with one hand, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. After today, you're legally protected as my wife. Adrian can't touch you without declaring war on House Blackthorn. Whatever happens during the ceremony, we complete the marriage. Understand? She understood perfectly. The vows were armor. Legal protection wrapped in ceremony and witnessed by enough powerful nobles that breaking the alliance would cost Adrian everything. And if someone tries to stop us, then we find out how committed they are to dying for Prince Adrian's conspiracy. Lucien's expression was utterly certain. Because I will kill anyone who tries to prevent this wedding, Serafina. Anyone. Noble blood, royal connections, none of it matters. You become my wife today, or I burn down everyone standing between us. The declaration should have sounded insane. Threats of mass murder delivered hours before a wedding. But Serafina had stopped measuring Lucien's words against normal standards. In his world, absolute commitment wasn't romantic hyperbole. It was tactical reality. The willingness to cross any line, pay any price, destroy any obstacle, and she'd become exactly ruthless enough to want that certainty more than anything softer. Then we complete the marriage. She held his gaze. And afterward, we find the traitor and make an example that ensures no one ever betrays House Blackthorn again. Lucien smiled with approval and possession in equal measure. You really have become terrifying. I learned from the best. He kissed her then, hard and claiming, before releasing her and returning to his weapons check. Ceremony starts at noon. Be ready for anything. Serafina left the armory with her heart pounding and her mind racing through contingencies. She'd survived one assassination attempt, killed a man, made alliances with dangerous nobles, agreed to marry the most feared duke in the kingdom, and somehow none of it felt like enough preparation for whatever was coming. The hours before the ceremony passed in tense silence. Guards moved through corridors with weapons ready. Household staff worked under watchful supervision. Visiting nobles arrived and were escorted to secured quarters where they'd remain until the ceremony began. Lord Brennan appeared mid-morning with his household guard and a sealed document case. He met privately with Lucien on in the study while Serafina waited outside, listening to muffled conversation through heavy doors. When Brennan emerged, his expression was grim. Your Grace. He bowed formally to Serafina. The evidence is secured. The moment Prince Adrian makes his move, we release everything publicly. He won't survive the scandal. And if he moves during the ceremony, then we adapt. Brennan's voice was steady. I've stationed my personal guards throughout the castle grounds. If violence erupts, you'll have support beyond House Blackthorn's forces.
Why are you doing this? Seraphina asked quietly. Really? What do you gain from helping us besides checking Adrian's power? The old lord studied her face for a long moment, because 30 years ago, I watched the border rebellion tear this kingdom apart, saw good men die for bad causes while the crown profited from the bloodshed. I'm too old to believe in heroes, Lady Vale,
but I'm not too old to recognize when ruthless people are better than insane ones. You think Lucien is ruthless but not insane. I think Duke Blackthorn understands that power requires control. Prince Adrian only understands that he wants more of it. Brennan glanced toward the study where Lucien was still reviewing documents. The Duke is dangerous, but he's predictable. Adrian is chaos wrapped in royal authority. That makes him exponentially more destructive. It was the most honest political assessment Seraphina had heard since arriving at Ravenspire. No propaganda, no carefully constructed narratives. Just brutal acknowledgement that sometimes the monster you could predict was safer than the one you couldn't. Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for being smart enough to recognize it. Brennan bowed again and departed toward his quarters, leaving Seraphina alone in the corridor. The chapel bells rang 11 times, 1 hour until the ceremony. Seraphina returned to her chambers to finish preparing. The seamstresses completed final adjustments. A maid arranged her dark hair in an elegant style that was formal enough for a duchess, but simple enough to maintain if circumstances deteriorated. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a stranger. The woman staring back had killed someone, had made alliances with dangerous men, had agreed to marry a duke feared throughout the kingdom for his brutality, had transformed from a grieving daughter seeking justice into something harder and more ruthless in barely 2 weeks. And the terrifying part was how natural the transformation felt. Like she'd always carried this capacity for calculated violence and political maneuvering, just needed the right circumstances to reveal it. Your Grace, it's time. Garrett appeared in the doorway. The guests are assembled. His Grace is waiting at the altar. Seraphina took a final breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the future she'd chosen with absolute clarity. The chapel was smaller than the grand cathedral in the capital, but infinitely more intimate. Stained glass windows threw colored light across ancient stone. Guards lined the walls in formal dress that didn't quite hide their weapons. Witnesses filled the pews, Lord Brennan in the front row, various minor nobles behind him, household staff in the back. And at the altar stood Lucien Blackthorn. He'd traded his usual dark leathers for formal attire that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than civilized, like violence dressed up for ceremony. His gray eyes tracked Seraphina's approach with possessive intensity that made her pulse quicken. This was happening. Actually happening. She reached the altar and Lucien took her hand, his grip warm and certain. The officiant began the ceremony with traditional words about union and loyalty and the binding of houses. Seraphina barely heard them. Her attention was focused on Lucien's face, reading the subtle tension in his jaw that meant he was tracking every person in the chapel, calculating threats, preparing for violence. Even now, standing at his own wedding, the Duke couldn't stop being a battlefield commander. The ceremony progressed through formal vows. Lucien's voice was steady and absolute when he spoke the words binding himself to her. Seraphina's own vows came out stronger than she'd expected, carrying none of the trembling uncertainty she'd feared. Because this wasn't surrender. It was partnership between equals who'd both decided survival mattered more than anything softer. The officiant reached the final section. By the authority granted by the crown and witnessed by the assembled nobility, I now pronounce you. The chapel doors exploded inward. Royal guards flooded through the entrance wearing the king's colors and carrying arrest warrants. Behind them strode Prince Adrian Valmont himself, resplendent in formal regalia and wearing an expression of righteous authority. Duke Lucien Blackthorn, you are hereby charged with treason against the crown, conspiracy to rebel, and harboring fugitives from royal justice. The prince's voice rang through the chapel. Surrender immediately or face execution for resisting lawful arrest. The entire chapel went silent. Seraphina felt Lucien's hand tighten on hers, the only outward sign of emotion crossing his face. But she could feel the violence coiling beneath his controlled exterior. The calculation happening behind those cold gray eyes. He was deciding whether to fight or negotiate, and either choice could get them both killed. Captain Morris and the Ravenspire guards moved to defensive positions immediately. Lord Brennan stood with his hand on his sword. The visiting nobles scrambled away from potential crossfire. Prince Adrian smiled with the kind of satisfaction that came from believing you'd already won. You have 10 seconds to comply, Duke Blackthorn. After that, my guards have orders to bring you to the capital in chains or a coffin. Your choice. Lucien released Serafina's hand and stepped forward, and she felt her heart stop because she couldn't tell if he was about to surrender or start a massacre in the middle of his own wedding. Then another voice cut through the tension like a blade. I'm afraid those arrest warrants are invalid, Your Highness. Lord Brennan moved to the center of the chapel holding a sealed document case. These are royal decrees signed by the king himself, predating your warrants by 3 months. They confirm Duke Blackthorn's loyalty to the crown and grant him full authority over the northern territories without interference from royal agents. Prince Adrian's expression shifted from satisfaction to fury. Those documents are forgeries. They bear the king's seal and signature authenticated by the royal archivists. Brennan's voice was steady. Unless you're suggesting your uncle is incompetent enough to sign fraudulent decrees, the trap was perfect. Adrian couldn't challenge the documents without questioning the king's judgment, but accepting them meant admitting his arrest warrants were based on false charges. The prince's face went dark with rage. You dare! I dare ensure the law is followed correctly. Brennan turned to address the assembled witnesses. Prince Adrian has been conducting an unauthorized conspiracy against House Blackthorn, using forged evidence and illegal mercenary forces. The proof is documented and will be released to the King's Council immediately. You're signing your own death warrant, old man. No. Brennan smiled coldly. I'm ending yours, Your Highness. Every noble in this chapel heard you attempt to arrest a duke on false charges during his wedding ceremony. That's treason. And unlike your fabricated accusations, mine have actual witnesses. Adrian's hand moved to his sword, and for a moment the entire chapel balanced on the edge of violence. Then Lucien spoke with quiet authority that somehow carried more weight than shouting. Prince Adrian, you've lost. Your conspiracy is exposed, your accusations proven false, and you're currently committing actual treason in front of 24 witnesses. Walk away now and you might survive with exile. Force this into combat, and I will personally ensure you don't leave Ravenspire breathing. The Duke's voice held no emotion, no anger, just the absolute certainty of someone stating factual reality. Adrian looked around the chapel at the guards, the witnesses, the political trap closing around him. Calculation warred with rage on his face. Finally, he stepped back. This isn't over, Blackthorn. His voice was poison. The crown will hear about this. All of it. I'm counting on it. Lucien's expression didn't change. Now get out of my wedding before I decide enforcing royal law includes executing traitors on holy ground. Prince Adrian turned and stormed from the chapel with his guards following. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, leaving stunned silence in their wake. Lord Brennan calmly returned to his seat in the front pew like nothing catastrophic had just occurred. The officiant cleared his throat nervously. Shall we, continue? Yes. Lucien returned to Serafina's side and took her hand again. Complete the ceremony. The old man fumbled through the final words with trembling hands. By the authority granted by the crown and witnessed by the assembled nobility, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may... Lucien kissed Serafina before the officiant finished speaking. It was claiming and possessive and carried the weight of everything they'd just survived. When he finally pulled back, his expression held grim satisfaction. You're mine now. Legally, completely, irreversibly. And you're mine. Serafina held his gaze. We survived together, or not at all? The witnesses applauded with the kind of enthusiasm that came from relief they weren't watching a massacre. Guards relaxed fractionally. Household staff began preparing for the wedding feast that would follow. But Serafina couldn't shake the cold certainty settling in her chest. They'd won this battle, exposed Adrian's conspiracy, completed the marriage that gave them legal protection. But something felt wrong. Adrian had given up too easily, walked away from a confrontation he'd clearly planned for. A man who'd orchestrated assassination attempts and funded mercenary attacks didn't just surrender when confronted with evidence. He had another move prepared. Serafina caught Lucien's wrist as they walked toward the chapel exit. This was too simple. I know.
His voice was barely a whisper. Stay close during the feast. Trust no one except Morris and Garrett.
The wedding feast was held in the Great Hall with all the formal ceremony expected of a ducal marriage. Long tables groaned under elaborate dishes. Wine flowed freely. Musicians played traditional songs while nobles offered congratulations and tried to assess what had actually happened during the interrupted ceremony. Lucien and Serafina sat at the head table receiving well wishes with practiced political grace. But beneath the performance, Serafina could feel the Duke's tension. He was scanning the room constantly, tracking movements, calculating threats. Lord Brennan approached midway through the feast with a sealed letter. Your Grace, this just arrived from my contact at the royal court. You need to read it immediately. Lucien broke the seal and read in silence. His expression didn't change, but Serafina saw his knuckles go white, gripping the paper. What is it? He handed her the letter without speaking. The message was from Brennan's intelligence network in the capital. Prince Adrian had left Ravenspire and ridden directly to the King's Council with evidence that Duke Blackthorne had been conspiring with foreign powers to overthrow the crown. The evidence included forged correspondence, falsified financial records, and testimony from witnesses who claimed to have personal knowledge of the conspiracy. It was all fabricated, obvious lies to anyone who investigated properly. But the King's Council wasn't investigating. They were preparing to authorize military intervention against House Blackthorne based on the prince's accusations, which meant Adrian had never intended to win at Ravenspire. The interrupted wedding, the exposed conspiracy, the humiliating retreat, all of it was theater designed to make them feel safe while he prepared the real attack. And now the entire might of the crown was mobilizing against them. Serafina looked at Lucien and saw the exact moment he realized they'd been outmaneuvered. He played us. The Duke's voice was carefully controlled. Made us think we'd won so we'd lower our guard. Now he has the council convinced we're traitors, and royal forces are probably already marching north. How long do we have? Days at most. Lucien stood abruptly. End the feast. Gather the senior staff and military commanders in the war room. Now. The celebration dissolved into controlled chaos as guards moved guests toward their quarters and household staff cleared the hall. Within 20 minutes, Lucien's inner circle was assembled in the war room staring at maps and casualty estimates. Captain Morris delivered the grim assessment. If the Crown authorizes full military intervention, we're looking at 3,000 royal troops supported by levies from Adrian's allied houses. We have maybe 800 trained soldiers and another 200 militia if we're generous. We can't win a direct engagement. Lucien's finger traced defensive positions on the map. We'd be crushed in open battle. Then we don't fight openly. Serafina studied the terrain. We use the northern mountains. Force them into narrow passes where numbers don't matter. Make it so costly that the Crown decides negotiation is cheaper than conquest. That's a guerrilla war that could last years. Brennan's voice was heavy. Thousands dead, territories burned, the kingdom destabilized beyond recovery. Better than execution for treason. Lucien looked around the table. Does anyone have a better option? Silence. Because they all understood the reality. Prince Adrian had forced them into an impossible position. Fight and face overwhelming odds. Surrender and face execution. Run and abandon everything they'd built. There were no good choices. Only survival or death. Serafina felt something crack inside her chest. They'd done everything right. Made alliances. Gathered evidence. Completed the marriage. And still they were trapped with their backs against a wall. She thought about her father dying for exposing the truth. About standing in Lucien's great hall 2 weeks ago believing she could find justice through legal channels. About how naive that hope seemed now that she understood how power actually worked. Justice didn't matter. Evidence didn't matter. Morality didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was being willing to become more ruthless than your enemies. And suddenly, Serafina knew exactly what they had to do. We release everything. Her voice cut through the silence. Every piece of evidence about the Border Rebellion weapons sales. Every document showing the Crown profited from the war. Every secret Lord Brennan has on Prince Adrian. All of it. Publicly. Immediately. That destroys the kingdom's faith in the monarchy. Lucien studied her face. Creates chaos that makes civil war inevitable. Good. Serafina met his eyes. Let it burn. Let the nobles who've been quietly supporting Adrian's conspiracy face public outrage. Let the Crown's legitimacy collapse under the weight of their own corruption. Force them into a position where they're fighting multiple rebellions instead of just us. You're talking about triggering the exact catastrophe we've been trying to prevent. I'm talking about survival. She stood and moved to the map. You taught me that power respects greater power. Right now, the Crown thinks they can crush us quietly. We need to make it clear that destroying House Blackthorn means destroying the entire kingdom's stability. Mutually assured destruction. The room went silent as everyone processed what she was suggesting. Lucien circled the table slowly, and Serafina couldn't read his expression. She'd just proposed burning down everything he'd spent years building. The political order, the carefully maintained alliances, the entire structure of power that kept the kingdom functioning. All of it sacrificed for survival. Finally, the Duke stopped in front of her and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. You understand what you're asking? If we do this, there's no return to normal. No peaceful resolution. We become the crisis that forces the kingdom to choose between royal authority and their own survival. I understand. Serafina held his gaze. And I'm asking anyway. Because I'd rather watch the kingdom burn than let them execute us for exposing the truth. Something shifted in Lucien's expression. Not quite approval, but recognition. She'd finally become exactly as ruthless as him. Willing to sacrifice anything, destroy anyone, burn down civilization itself rather than accept defeat. It should have horrified her. Instead, it felt like finally understanding the rules completely. Lucien turned to address the assembled commanders. Lord Brennan, release all evidence to every merchant guild, foreign embassy, and noble house we have contacts with. Morris, prepare defensive positions in the mountain passes. Garrett, evacuate non-essential household staff to the northern estates. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried absolute authority. As of this moment, House Blackthorn is in open rebellion against the crown. Not because we want war, but because they've given us no alternative except execution. We fight, we survive, or we take the entire kingdom down with us. The commanders dispersed to execute their orders, leaving Lucien and Serafina alone in the war room, surrounded by maps of territories that might soon become battlefields. This is your wedding night. Lucien's voice held dark humor. Congratulations on marrying into a house about to be declared traitors to the crown. Serafina moved closer and took his hand. I knew what I was choosing. Did you? His thumb brushed across her knuckles. Because 6 hours ago you became my wife. Now you're a rebel against royal authority. That's treason, Serafina. If we lose, they'll execute you beside me. Then we don't lose. She pulled him toward her. We survive. Together. Exactly like we promised. Lucien kissed her with desperate intensity, like he was trying to memorize the moment before everything descended into chaos. When he finally pulled back, his expression was raw in a way she'd never seen before. I've spent my entire life learning not to need anyone, not to become vulnerable through attachment. My father taught me that love was weakness and mercy invited death. And I believed him, because I saw what happened to people who let their guard down in this world. But you make me want things I swore I'd never risk. Partnership, trust, someone who stands beside me instead of behind me. And that terrifies me more than any army the crown can field. Serafina felt her throat tighten, because she understood exactly what he meant. Caring about someone gave your enemies leverage, created vulnerabilities, made you willing to sacrifice tactical advantage for emotional attachment. It was the most dangerous thing either of them could do, and they'd done it anyway. I'm terrified too. She touched his scarred jaw. But I'd rather face that fear with you than survive alone. Then we face it together. Lucien's hand tightened on her waist. Whatever comes next, we don't break. We don't surrender. We become exactly what they fear most. Before Serafina could respond, Captain Morris burst through the war room door without knocking. Your Grace, we have a situation. Lord Brennan just collapsed during dinner. The physicians think he was poisoned. The world tilted sideways, because Lord Brennan was their only powerful ally. The source of evidence against Prince Adrian. The political legitimacy that made their rebellion something other than simple treason. Without him, they were isolated, vulnerable, exactly what Adrian needed them to be. Lucien was already moving toward the door. How bad? Critical. The physicians aren't sure he'll survive the night. Morris's expression was grim. And Your Grace. Before he lost consciousness, he said to tell you the evidence was already released. Everything. Every document, every secret, every piece of ammunition we had against the crown. Serafina felt ice form in her chest. That's good, right? That's what we planned. No. Lucian's voice was flat. Because we were supposed to control the release, leak it strategically through trusted sources who could verify authenticity and manage the narrative. But if Brennan released everything in desperation while dying from poison, it's just going to look like fabricated propaganda from traitors trying to justify rebellion, which meant their greatest weapon had just become their biggest liability. And suddenly Serafina understood the full scope of Prince Adrian's plan. He'd never tried to stop them from getting evidence. He'd encouraged it, let them gather documentation, allowed Brennan to consolidate everything in one place, then poisoned the old lord and forced a panicked release that made everything look like desperate lies instead of verified truth. One move, one assassination, and Adrian had turned their victory into defeat. The Duke stood in the center of his war room, surrounded by maps of battles he might not survive, and for the first time since Serafina met him, she saw actual fear cross his face. Not fear of death. Lucien had never feared dying, fear that he'd failed, that his careful planning, his ruthless tactics, his absolute commitment to survival weren't enough against an enemy willing to be more unpredictable than him. Your Grace. Morris's voice was careful. What are your orders? Lucien looked at Serafina, and she saw the question in his eyes. The unspoken acknowledgement that they'd just lost their greatest ally, credibility for their evidence, and any hope of political resolution. They were alone against the crown, with rebellion as their only option and execution waiting if they failed. And the choice he was offering her was simple: run or fight. Serafina thought about her father dying for telling the truth, about arriving at Ravenspire 2 weeks ago believing justice was possible through proper channels, about everything she'd learned since then about how power actually worked. She'd killed for survival, married for protection, agreed to rebellion for victory, and now she had one choice left: become the monster this kingdom demanded or die trying to remain something softer. Serafina took Lucian's hand and spoke with absolute certainty. We fight. No retreat, no surrender, no mercy for anyone who stands with the crown. They wanted a war. Let's give them exactly what they fear most. Lucian's expression shifted into something predatory and satisfied, because his wife had just proven herself willing to sacrifice everything for survival. And that made them the most dangerous partnership in the kingdom, even if it meant burning civilization to ash in the process. Lord Brennan died 3 hours after midnight. The physician said it was poison, something slow-acting and deliberate that gave him just enough time to release the evidence before his heart stopped. His final words were a warning that Prince Adrian had planted agents throughout Ravenspire, that the conspiracy ran deeper than they'd realized, that trusting anyone was suicide. Then he stopped breathing, and the last political ally House Blackthorn possessed disappeared with him. Lucien stood over this corpse in the medical chamber while dawn light bled through the windows, and Serafina watched her husband's face transform into something she'd never seen before. Not anger, not grief, something colder and more absolute. Pure calculation stripped of every human emotion except the will to survive. Get him prepared for a burial with full honors. The Duke's voice was flat. Send word to his estate that Lord Brennan died defending House Blackthorn against Crown conspiracy. Make him a martyr the kingdom can't ignore. Garrett nodded and began issuing quiet orders to the attending staff. Lucien turned to Captain Morris. Status report on the evidence release. Complete chaos, Your Grace. Morris looked exhausted. Brennan's contacts distributed everything to merchant guilds, foreign embassies, noble houses across the kingdom. The documents are spreading faster than we can track. But without Brennan alive to verify authenticity, half the recipients think it's fabricated propaganda. And the other half believe it completely and are demanding the King's Council answer the accusations. The old captain's expression was grim. We've created exactly the crisis you predicted. The kingdom is fracturing between crown loyalists who think we're traitors and reformists who think the monarchy is corrupt. How long before it turns violent? It already has. Reports of riots in 3 major cities. Noble houses choosing sides. Merchants refusing to trade with crown-aligned territories. Morris paused. Your Grace, this is the beginning of civil war. Serafina felt the weight of that reality settle into her bones. They'd done this. Released evidence that destroyed the kingdom's stability because survival demanded it. And now thousands of people who'd never heard of House Blackthorn or Prince Adrian's conspiracy were going to die in the chaos. The cost of staying alive kept climbing. But looking at Lucien's face,
She knew he'd pay any price rather than surrender. Had spent his entire life learning that mercy was weakness and hesitation invited death.
The kingdom burning was tragic but acceptable if it meant House Blackthorn survived, and Seraphina had become ruthless enough to agree with that calculation. She'd crossed too many lines to pretend she was anything except complicit now. Killed for survival, married for protection, triggered rebellion for victory. Every choice had brought her closer to becoming exactly what this world demanded, a monster dressed in noble titles and wedding vows. Your Grace. A messenger burst through the medical chamber doors, covered in road dust and bleeding from a gash across his arm. Royal forces 3,000 strong just crossed the northern border. They're burning villages, executing anyone suspected of loyalty to House Blackthorn, and demanding your immediate surrender. The room went silent, because 3,000 trained soldiers backed by the Crown's authority wasn't a force you negotiated with. It was an execution squad designed to crush rebellion before it could spread. And they were maybe 2 days from Ravenspire. How many casualties in the villages? Lucicien's voice stayed controlled, but Seraphina saw his hand tighten on his sword hilt. Dozens confirmed dead. The messenger was shaking. They're not taking prisoners, Your Grace. Anyone who doesn't immediately swear loyalty to the crown is being executed as a traitor. Children? The messenger's silence was answer enough. Seraphina felt something cold and terrible settle in her chest. Prince Adrian wasn't just attacking House Blackthorn anymore. He was using collective punishment, turning the northern territories into examples of what happened when you defied royal authority. It was the kind of brutality that created martyrs and justified atrocities in response. Lucian stood perfectly still for 5 seconds. Then he turned to Morris with an expression of absolute certainty. Evacuate every civilian from the northern approach. Get them into the mountain strongholds where royal forces can't reach them. Burn the villages ourselves if we have to. Leave nothing Adrian's soldiers can use for supply or shelter.
That's scorched earth tactics, Your Grace. Morris looked shocked. Those are our people's homes, and they'll rebuild after we win. The Duke's tone was flat. Right now,
keeping them alive matters more than preserving buildings. Execute the evacuation immediately. Morris saluted and disappeared to organize the retreat. Seraphina waited until they were alone before speaking. You're planning to fight 3,000 soldiers with 800 guards and militia.
No. Lucian moved to the window overlooking Ravenspire's courtyard. I'm planning to make it so costly that the crown decides killing us isn't worth the casualties. We use the mountain passes.
Force them into narrow terrain where their numbers become liability instead of advantage. Make them bleed for every mile until they're too weak to assault the castle. And if they don't break, then we make our stand here, in the fortress my ancestors built to withstand sieges. He looked at her with those cold gray eyes. And we find out if House Blackthorn's reputation is enough to hold against the entire kingdom's military might. The unspoken reality hung between them. They were probably going to die.
The odds were overwhelming. Even with perfect tactics and maximum casualties inflicted on royal forces, eventually the numbers would crush them. But Lucien had decided that dying on his feet fighting was preferable to execution on his knees begging, and Seraphina had married him knowing exactly who he was. How long do we have? She asked quietly. 2 days before they reach the outer defenses. Maybe 4 if we delay them in the mountain passes. Lucian's voice stayed steady. After that, it's siege warfare until someone breaks. Then we use the time we have. Seraphina moved to stand beside him. Get everyone we can't protect out of the castle. Anyone who stays needs to understand they're choosing to die beside us. You're talking about sending away most of the household staff. Lucian studied her face. The people who've served House Blackthorn for generations. I'm talking about not getting them massacred when royal forces breach the walls. She held his gaze. Loyalty is worth protecting. That means giving them the choice to survive instead of forcing them to die for a battle they didn't start. Something shifted in Lucien's expression. Recognition, maybe. That his wife understood the difference between necessary sacrifice and pointless cruelty. Garrett appeared in the doorway looking older than Seraphina had ever seen him. Your Grace, the household staff is requesting permission to speak with you directly. They gathered in the great hall where 2 weeks ago Seraphina had first met the Duke and refused to lower her eyes. Now that same hall was filled with servants, guards, craftsmen, and minor nobles who'd served House Blackthorn through generations of loyalty that transcended simple employment. Lucien stood before them with Seraphina at his side, and for a moment she saw him as they must see him. Not the feared duke who ruled through brutality, but the lord whose decisions determined whether they lived or died. The weight of that responsibility should have crushed anyone with a conscience. But Lucien had spent years learning to carry weight that would break normal men. "You know what's coming," his voice carried through the hall without shouting. "Royal forces burning their way north with orders to execute anyone loyal to House Blackthorn. A siege that will turn this castle into a tomb if we lose. I won't lie to you about the odds. We're outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of political options." The assembled staff stayed silent, waiting. "So I'm giving you a choice." Lucien's expression was utterly serious. "Leave now with my blessing and enough coin to restart your lives somewhere beyond the crown's immediate reach. Or stay and fight knowing you'll probably die beside me when royal forces breach these walls." No one moved. Seraphina felt her throat tighten, watching these people who had every reason to run choose to remain standing in a great hall that might become their grave. Then the head cook, an elderly woman who'd served House Blackthorn since before Lucien's father died, stepped forward. "Begging your grace's pardon, but we already made our choice when we didn't run the night those mercenaries attacked. We stay. We fight. And if we die, at least we die knowing we stood with the Duke who actually protected us, instead of the crown that wants us executed for loyalty." Others nodded. Murmured agreement rippled through the hall, because they'd seen Lucien defend them against assassination attempts, watched him execute traitors without hesitation, witnessed him choose scorched earth over letting his people become collateral damage in someone else's political ambitions. He was brutal and ruthless and absolutely committed to survival. But he was their brutal, ruthless lord, and that mattered more than abstract loyalty to a crown that had never protected the northern territories from anything. Lucien's expression didn't change, but Seraphina saw his shoulders straighten fractionally. The weight of command accepting the loyalty being offered, even knowing it would likely cost these people everything. "Then you fight under House Blackthorn colors." The Duke's voice was steady. "And I swear on my family's name that if we survive this, every person in this hall will be rewarded beyond measure. But if we fall, you take what revenge you can and make sure the kingdom remembers that Ravenspire died fighting." The staff dispersed to prepare for war, leaving Seraphina and Lucien alone in the great hall where their impossible alliance had begun. "This is suicide," she spoke quietly. "You know that, right? Even with perfect tactics, we can't hold against 3,000 soldiers." "Probably not." Lucien turned to face her. "But I'd rather die defending what I built than live knowing I surrendered to bastards who murdered your father and tried to execute us for exposing the truth. That's not strategy. That's pride." "No." His hand came up to cup her jaw. "That's understanding that some things matter more than survival. You taught me that, standing in my great hall refusing to lower your eyes, challenging my authority in front of witnesses, choosing to investigate your father's murder, even knowing it could get you killed." He pulled her closer until their foreheads touched. "You made me want partnership instead of control. Made me care about someone enough that losing you feels worse than dying. That's not pride, Seraphina. That's finally understanding why my father was wrong about love being weakness. Because the strongest thing I've ever done was letting you stand beside me instead of behind me." Seraphina felt tears sting her eyes and force them back through sheer will. Crying was luxury they couldn't afford when royal forces were burning toward them. "Then we make them pay." Her voice was steady despite the emotion clawing at her throat. "For my father, for Brennan, for every person they've murdered to keep their conspiracy hidden. We make the cost so high that history remembers House Blackthorn died fighting instead of begging." Lucien kissed her with desperate intensity, like he was trying to memorize the moment before everything descended into final violence. When he pulled back, his expression had shifted into the battlefield commander she'd seen carve through mercenaries without hesitation. "Get some rest. We move at dawn to establish defensive positions in the mountain passes. After that, it's constant warfare until someone breaks." Seraphina left him in the great hall making final preparations and retreated to their chambers. The rooms that should have been their wedding suite now felt like a condemned prisoner's cell. Elegant furniture and expensive tapestries that would burn when royal forces breached the castle. She tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't stop calculating. 800 defenders against 3,000 attackers. Mountain passes that could delay but not stop a determined assault. A siege that would end with everyone inside these walls dead or captured.
The mathematics of survival had finally turned against them. Around 3 in the morning, Lucien joined her in their chambers. He moved silently through the darkness and climbed into bed, still wearing most of his armor, like he expected violence to erupt at any moment. Serafina rolled to face him. "Can't sleep either? Too much to plan." His voice was quiet in the darkness. "I keep running scenarios and they all end the same way. We delay them, inflict casualties, make them bleed. But eventually the numbers crush us. Then why fight? Because the alternative is execution, and I'd rather die on my terms." He was silent for a moment. "I'm sorry I dragged you into this. You should have been safe once we married, protected by House Blackthorn's authority. Instead, you're going to die beside me in a siege we can't win." Serafina reached out and found his hand in the darkness. "I chose this. Chose you. Chose to expose the conspiracy knowing it might cost everything. So don't apologize for giving me exactly what I asked for. Partnership until the end?" "Until the end." She pulled him closer. "However that comes." They lay together in the darkness, listening to guards moving through corridors below, and the distant sound of evacuees leaving through the northern gates. Tomorrow they would march to war against overwhelming odds. Tomorrow, the real violence would begin. But tonight, they had this moment, this fragile peace before the storm. And for the first time since her father died, Serafina felt something close to certainty settle in her chest. Not certainty they would survive, but certainty that she'd rather die beside Lucien Blackthorn fighting for something real than live safely somewhere else, pretending the conspiracy hadn't destroyed everything she'd loved. That was the final lesson this world had taught her. Sometimes the only victory available was choosing how you fell. Dawn came too fast. Lucien moved through the castle, issuing final orders with the controlled precision of someone who'd spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of desperate battle. Guards assembled in the courtyard carrying weapons and wearing expressions that mixed determination with fatalistic acceptance. Supply wagons loaded with arrows, medical supplies, and enough provisions to sustain a fighting retreat. Captain Morris approached with the final count. 812 combat-ready soldiers. Another 200 militia armed with hunting weapons and courage. He paused. "Your Grace, we received a messenger from the royal forces demanding your surrender within 12 hours, or they'll execute every civilian they capture during the advance." Standard intimidation tactics. Lucien checked his sword with automatic precision. "Ignore it. They're going to kill civilians regardless. At least this way we're not giving them legitimacy by pretending negotiation is possible." The Duke mounted his warhorse and addressed the assembled forces. His voice carried across the courtyard without effort, commanding attention through sheer presence rather than volume. "In 4 hours, we march to the mountain passes and establish defensive positions. Our goal is simple: make the crown bleed for every mile they advance. Force them to pay in casualties for the privilege of executing us. And when they finally reach these walls, we make our stand knowing we fought with everything we had." He paused, scanning the faces of soldiers who would probably die following his orders. House Blackthorn has always survived by being willing to do what others wouldn't. Today, we prove that philosophy one final time. We don't surrender. We don't negotiate. We fight until we win or until there's no one left to kill us. The soldiers roared approval, not because they believed they'd win, but because Lucien had given them permission to die on their feet instead of their knees. Serafina stood beside her husband wearing leather armor borrowed from the castle's stores and carrying a sword she'd spent the last day learning to use properly. She wasn't a warrior, would probably be liability in actual combat. But standing behind walls while Lucien fought was impossible. She'd come too far, sacrificed too much, become too ruthless to hide while he faced death alone. They rode north with 800 soldiers following and smoke rising from villages Adrian's forces had burned during their advance. The mountain passes loomed ahead like jagged teeth, ready to tear apart anything foolish enough to enter. Perfect terrain for ambush and guerrilla warfare. Narrow passages where superior numbers became crushing liability. High ground that favored defenders willing to rain arrows and boulders down on advancing forces. If they were going to have any chance, this was where they'd make it. Morris had scouted the primary pass and identified 3 choke points where they could stage defensive positions. Lucien deployed forces with tactical precision honed over years of actual combat. Archers on the heights, pike formations blocking the narrowest sections.
Mobile sazi, wall reserves ready to reinforce wherever the line weakened. It was textbook defensive warfare executed by people who knew they were already dead.
The royal forces arrived 6 hours later. 3,000 soldiers in perfect formation carrying the king's colors and wearing expressions of righteous certainty. They'd been told House Blackthorn was traitor territory that needed to be crushed for the kingdom's security. Probably believed they were heroes enforcing justice. They had no idea they were walking into a killing field designed by one of the most dangerous military commanders the kingdom had ever produced. Prince Adrian rode at the head of the column wearing ornate armor that had probably never seen actual combat. He carried himself with the arrogant certainty of someone who'd never lost a battle because he'd never actually fought one. When he saw Lucien's forces blocking the pass, he smiled. Duke Blackthorn. The prince's voice echoed off stone walls. Your last chance to surrender peacefully. Lay down your weapons and submit to crown justice. Lucien sat on his war horse perfectly still. Then he drew his sword and held it high enough that the afternoon sun caught the blade. Come take them. Adrian's smile vanished. He gestured to his commanders and the royal forces began their advance. What followed wasn't battle. It was systematic slaughter. The narrow pass funneled royal soldiers into kill zones where Ravenspire archers cut them down by dozens. Bodies piled in choke points, creating obstacles that slowed the advance further. When royal forces tried to climb the heights, defenders pushed boulders that crushed entire squads. The crown had superior numbers, but Lucien had superior position and the absolute willingness to turn terrain into a graveyard. Serafina watched from a protected position as her husband orchestrated the defense with cold precision. He didn't fight on the front lines like some glory-seeking noble. He commanded from where he could see the entire battlefield and adjust tactics in real time. And royal forces died in numbers that should have forced retreat. But Prince Adrian kept sending soldiers forward, wave after wave crashing against Ravenspire's defensive positions like ocean trying to erode stone through persistence. By nightfall, the pass was choked with corpses, and the royal advance had gained maybe 200 yards at the cost of 600 casualties. Lucien's forces had lost 40 soldiers and inflicted 15 times that damage. But the mathematics hadn't changed. Royal forces still had overwhelming numbers. They could afford to trade bodies for ground. Eventually, they'd push through or find another route. Morris approached Lucien's command position covered in blood that probably wasn't his. Your Grace, we can't hold this position much longer. They're preparing flanking maneuvers around the eastern ridge. Then we fall back to the second choke point. Lucien's voice was steady despite the carnage. Make them pay for every inch. The retreat was organized chaos. Ravenspire forces withdrew under cover of darkness, while leaving traps and obstacles that would slow royal pursuit. By dawn, they'd established new defensive positions deeper in the mountain passes, and the killing began again. 3 days passed in brutal repetition: fight, bleed, retreat. Inflict maximum casualties while preserving their own forces. Turn the mountains into a nightmare that royal commanders would remember for the rest of their lives. By the 4th day, Lucien's 800 defenders had been reduced to 520. Royal forces had lost over 1,500 soldiers. The mathematics were finally shifting in their favor through sheer attrition. But Prince Adrian refused to retreat, kept throwing soldiers at defensive positions like he had infinite reserves and no concern for casualties. Because he didn't care how many commoners died. He wanted Lucien and Serafina dead more than he wanted military victory. That made him infinitely more dangerous than any rational opponent. On the 5th day, royal forces finally broke through the last mountain choke point and began the final advance toward Ravenspire Castle. Lucien pulled his remaining forces back behind the fortress walls and prepared for siege. The castle that had stood for 400 years was about to face its greatest test. Serafina stood on the battlements beside her husband, watching royal forces establish siege positions in the valley below. They'd been reduced to barely 1,500 effective soldiers, but they still outnumbered Ravenspire's defenders 3-1. In Prince Adrian's command tent flew banners declaring no quarter would be given to traitors. This is it. Lucien's voice was quiet. Final stand. We hold these walls, or we die trying. How long can we last? Weeks if they try to starve us out. Days if they assault directly. His expression was unreadable. Adrian's too impatient for siege warfare. He'll attack within 48 hours. Serafina looked at the man she'd married barely a week ago. The Duke who'd taught her that survival required ruthlessness and mercy was weakness. Who'd chosen to fight impossible odds rather than surrender. Who'd somehow become the only person in the kingdom she trusted completely. I don't regret it. She spoke quietly. Any of it. Marrying you, exposing the conspiracy, triggering the rebellion. I'd make the same choices again. Even knowing it ends like this, especially knowing it ends like this. She took his hand. Because I'd rather spend 1 week standing beside you than a lifetime safe somewhere else pretending I didn't know the truth. Lucien pulled her close and kissed her with desperate intensity. When he finally pulled back, his expression held something she'd never seen before. Not the cold calculation of a battlefield commander. Not the ruthless certainty of a duke who ruled through fear. Just a man who'd finally learned that the strongest thing he'd ever done was letting himself care about someone enough that losing them felt worse than dying. I love you. The words came out rough, unpracticed, like he'd never said them before and wasn't sure how they should sound. And I'm sorry I couldn't keep you safe. Serafina felt tears sting her eyes. You did keep me safe. Longer than anyone else could have, and you gave me something worth fighting for. They stood together on the battlements watching royal forces prepare for the assault that would decide everything. And Serafina understood with absolute clarity that this was the final lesson. Power couldn't protect you from everything. Ruthlessness couldn't guarantee survival. Sometimes you made every right choice and still lost because the world was chaos dressed up as order, and the only control you actually had was choosing how you faced the end. Lucien had taught her to be ruthless, to sacrifice anything for survival, to become the monster this kingdom demanded. But he'd also taught her that even monsters could find something worth dying for. And that was enough. Below them, royal forces began moving siege equipment into position. Above them, storm clouds gathered over mountains that had witnessed 400 years of House Blackthorn's survival. 48 hours until the final assault. 48 hours until they discovered if legends could survive when kingdoms turned against them. 48 hours until the Duke of Ravenspire and his Duchess made their last stand against the entire crown's authority. And somewhere in the valley below, Prince Adrian smiled because he thought he'd already won. He had no idea that the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't an army at your gates. It was two people with nothing left to lose and everything to prove standing together on fortress walls. Built by ancestors who understood that sometimes survival meant becoming the nightmare everyone feared. The storm broke at midnight, and with it came the final reckoning that would determine whether House Blackthorn died as traitors or legends. The storm that broke over Ravenspire at midnight brought rain so heavy it turned the valley into a sea of mud. Lightning split the sky like the gods themselves were trying to tear the world apart. Thunder rolled across mountains that had witnessed 4 centuries of House Blackthorn's survival and now prepared to witness its final stand. Lucien stood on the battlements watching royal forces struggle with siege equipment that kept sinking into saturated ground. The storm had bought them maybe 12 hours. Delayed the assault Prince Adrian had planned for dawn, but delay wasn't victory, just postponement of the inevitable. Captain Morris joined him on the walls, rain streaming off his armor. Your Grace, the eastern wall has structural damage from the storm. If they breach there during the assault, we won't be able to hold. Then we don't let them breach. Lucien's voice was steady despite knowing the mathematics. Concentrate our remaining forces at the weak points. Make them pay in blood for every foot of wall they take. We're down to 480 effective soldiers. Morris spoke quietly. They still have 1,400. The numbers don't work, Your Grace. Numbers never worked for House Blackthorn. Lucien turned to face his oldest commander. My ancestors held this castle against armies twice what we're facing. They survived because they were willing to do what their enemies wouldn't. Today, we prove that lesson one final time. Morris studied the Duke's face for a long moment. Then he saluted with the kind of respect that transcended simple military protocol. It's been an honor serving House Blackthorn, Your Grace, whatever happens tomorrow. The honor was mine, Captain. Lucien gripped the older man's shoulder. Make sure everyone understands. We fight until we can't anymore. And if I fall, you get Serafina out through the northern passage. She doesn't die in this castle. Your Grace, she won't leave you. Then make her. That's an order. Lucien's expression was absolute. She survives. That's all that matters. Morris disappeared into the storm to relay orders, leaving Lucien alone with thoughts that had been circling since they'd retreated behind these walls. He'd spent his entire life building toward this moment without realizing it. Every lesson his father taught about power requiring ruthlessness. Every battle won through superior tactics and willingness to accept casualties. Every political alliance forged through careful calculation rather than trust. All of it leading to standing on fortress walls waiting for an army to crush everything he'd built. And the strangest part was discovering that the thing he regretted most wasn't losing his territory or his title or even his life. It was not having more time with Serafina, the woman who'd walked into his great hall 2 weeks ago wearing mourning black and refusing to lower her eyes, who'd challenged his authority, exposed his vulnerabilities, and somehow made him want partnership more than control, who taught him that the strongest thing he'd ever done was letting himself care about someone enough that losing them felt worse than dying. His father had been wrong about everything that mattered. Love wasn't weakness. Mercy wasn't surrender. And the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't becoming vulnerable through attachment. It was spending your entire life so afraid of vulnerability that you never discovered what you were actually capable of when you had something worth protecting beyond your own survival. Lucien had learned that lesson too late, but at least he'd learned it, and that would have to be enough. Serafina found him an hour before dawn, still standing on the battlements watching royal forces prepare for assault. The storm had passed, leaving everything sharp and immediate in the pre-dawn darkness. "You should be resting." Lucien didn't turn from his observation. "The fighting starts in hours, so should you." She moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "But neither of us can sleep knowing what's coming. No." He finally looked at her, and Serafina saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Not the cold calculation of a battlefield commander, not the ruthless certainty of a duke who ruled through fear, just exhaustion and acceptance and something that looked almost like peace. "I'm sorry I couldn't give you more time." More time for what? Everything. Lucien's hand found hers in the darkness. Being married, building something that mattered, discovering what we could have been together if the kingdom hadn't forced us into this corner. We discovered it anyway. Serafina held his gaze. "In 2 weeks, we built more than most people find in a lifetime." "That's enough." "Is it?" "It has to be." She touched his scarred jaw. "Because regretting what we can't change is luxury we don't have when royal forces are preparing to kill us." Lucien pulled her close and kissed her with desperate intensity. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. "If I fall during the assault, Morris has orders to get you out through the northern passage. Don't argue. Don't refuse. Just survive and make sure the kingdom remembers that House Blackthorn died fighting instead of begging." Serafina felt tears sting her eyes and forced them back through sheer will. "And if you somehow win, then I spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." His voice was rough with emotion. "Build the kingdom you wanted instead of the one I inherited. Learn to rule through something other than fear." "That's not the man I married." "No!" Lucien's expression shifted into something she recognized, the ruthless certainty that had attracted her from the beginning. "The man I am fights until there's nothing left to fight with. But the man I want to become learns from the woman who taught me that strength isn't just about being willing to destroy everything. Sometimes it's about being willing to build something worth protecting." Dawn broke over Ravenspire with crystalline clarity. Royal forces assembled in perfect formation, siege ladders ready, battering rams positioned, archers prepared to provide covering fire, 1,400 soldiers wearing the king's colors and carrying Prince Adrian's orders to show no mercy. Lucien addressed his remaining forces in the courtyard. His voice carried without effort, commanding attention through presence rather than volume. What follows will determine whether House Blackthorn survives or becomes footnote in someone else's history. We're outnumbered, exhausted, and fighting against the entire crown's authority. But we have something they don't. We know what we're fighting for. He paused, scanning the faces of soldiers who would probably die following his orders. Not territory, not titles, not even survival. We're fighting for the simple truth that loyalty should mean something, that exposing corruption shouldn't cost your life, that standing beside your people matters more than kneeling before distant kings who've never bled for the lands they claim to rule. His hand moved to rest on the sword his father had carried during the border rebellion. "My ancestors built this castle to survive when everything else fell apart. Today we honor that legacy. We hold these walls not because we think we'll win, but because dying on our feet fighting for something real is better than living on our knees pretending we don't know the truth." The soldiers roared approval with voices that mixed determination and fatalistic acceptance, because Lucien had given them permission to make their deaths mean something, instead of just being casualties in someone else's political ambitions. The assault began 30 minutes later. Royal forces hit the walls in coordinated waves designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers. Siege ladders slammed against stone. Battering rams crashed into gates. Arrows filled the sky like deadly rain. Ravenspire's defenders fought with desperate efficiency. Boiling oil poured onto climbing soldiers. Archers picked off officers and broke formations. Pike formations held choke points while reserves reinforced wherever the line weakened. But the mathematics hadn't changed. Royal forces could afford to trade bodies for ground. Eventually, they'd push through. Serafina fought beside Lucien on the eastern wall, where structural damage made the position most vulnerable. She wasn't a trained warrior. Her sword work was adequate at best. But she could hold a line long enough for reinforcements to arrive, and that was all that mattered. The fighting was nothing like the mercenary attack 2 weeks ago. This was sustained warfare where exhaustion killed as surely as enemy blades. Hours of constant violence until your arms burned and your legs trembled and you kept fighting anyway because stopping meant dying. She killed 3 soldiers, maybe 4, lost count during the chaos. Watched Lucien carve through enemies with terrifying precision while simultaneously coordinating defensive positions and adjusting tactics in real time. The Duke fought like a man who'd already accepted death and decided to take as many enemies with him as possible. By midday, the eastern wall had been breached. Royal forces poured through the gap in numbers that overwhelmed the immediate defenders. Captain Morris led a desperate counterattack that pushed them back temporarily, but the damage was done. They couldn't hold the walls anymore. Lucien ordered a fighting retreat to the inner keep. The last defensible position before the castle fell completely. What followed was brutal close-quarters combat through corridors that ran red with blood from both sides. Royal forces paid in casualties for every room they took. Ravenspire defenders made them earn every inch, but the numbers kept crushing them. By late afternoon, Lucien's forces had been reduced to maybe 250 effective soldiers holding the inner keep against 800 attackers. The mathematics had finally turned completely against them. Serafina stood in the great hall where she'd first met Lucien, surrounded by wounded defenders and the corpses of people who'd chosen to die beside them. Her armor was dented and bloody. Her sword arm trembled with exhaustion, and still royal forces kept coming. Captain Morris appeared through the smoke carrying orders. "Your Grace, they're preparing final assault on the keep. We have maybe an hour before they breach the doors. Then we make our stand here." Lucien's voice was steady, despite the carnage. "Final position. We hold this hall or we die trying." Morris saluted and disappeared to organize the defense. Lucien turned to Serafina with an expression that mixed acceptance and regret. "This is it. Final moments. I'm sorry I couldn't give you victory. You gave me something better." She took his hand. "You gave me truth. Partnership. Someone who chose to stand beside me instead of using me as shield or weapon. That's not enough. It's everything." Serafina pulled him close. "Because I've learned that power doesn't matter if you lose yourself getting it. Territory means nothing if you become monster to hold it. And winning isn't actually victory if you have to sacrifice everything worth protecting. You've become wiser than me." "No." She touched his face. "I've just learned to value what matters instead of what survives." The keep doors exploded inward under coordinated assault. Royal forces flooded into the great hall in overwhelming numbers. The final battle began with desperate intensity from defenders who knew they were already dead. Lucien fought at the center of the formation with Serafina beside him, back-to-back holding ground that became increasingly smaller as soldiers fell around them. The Duke carved through enemies with precision born from years of combat, while simultaneously calling tactical adjustments that kept their shrinking defensive position from collapsing completely. But exhaustion and numbers were finally crushing them. Serafina felt her strength failing, her sword growing heavier with each parry, her vision narrowing from blood loss and fatigue. They were going to die here, in the great hall where their alliance began, surrounded by people who'd chosen loyalty over survival. And somehow that felt right, appropriate even, dying beside the man she'd married while defending something that actually mattered instead of just surviving. Then the great hall doors on the opposite side burst open and something impossible happened. Fresh soldiers wearing unfamiliar colors poured into the hall, attacking royal forces from behind. The new arrivals fought with disciplined precision that spoke of professional military training, and leading them was a face Serafina recognized from royal court portraits, King Edward himself, looking older and more exhausted than any painting suggested. The battle devolved into confused chaos as royal forces tried to respond to the unexpected assault from their own monarch. Officers shouted contradictory orders, formations broke, Soldiers hesitated between fighting and surrendering. Prince Adrian appeared through the smoke wearing armor covered in other people's blood and an expression of absolute fury. "Uncle." The prince's voice carried venom. "This is treason. You're attacking your own forces."
"No." The king's voice was tired but certain. "I'm stopping a conspiracy that's been using my authority to murder loyal subjects. Drop your weapons, Adrian. This ends now. You're weak."
The prince's hand moved to his sword. "You've always been weak. That's why the kingdom needs someone willing to make hard choices." Murdering a duke who exposed your corruption isn't hard choice. King Edward stepped forward. It's cowardice dressed up as strength. And I won't allow it to continue.
"Then you'll die beside these traitors." Prince Adrian drew his sword and lunged at the king with desperate fury. Lucien moved faster. The duke crossed the hall in 3 strides and intercepted Adrian's attack.
Their blades clashed with the sound of all the violence and conspiracy that had led to this moment crystallizing into single combat. Prince Adrian fought with rage and entitlement, the fury of someone who'd always gotten what they wanted and couldn't understand why the world had finally said no. Lucien fought with exhaustion and absolute commitment, the ruthless certainty of someone who'd survived this long by being willing to pay any price for victory. The duel lasted maybe 2 minutes. Then Lucien's blade found the gap in Adrian's armor and drove home with lethal precision. The prince collapsed, choking on blood and broken certainty, and the conspiracy that had murdered Seraphina's father finally died with him. The great hall went silent except for labored breathing and the sounds of wounded soldiers. Royal forces dropped their weapons. Ravenspire defenders lowered blades but maintained positions. Everyone waited to see what the king would do. King Edward moved to where Prince Adrian lay dying and looked down at his nephew with an expression that mixed grief and exhaustion. "You could have been great, could have served this kingdom with honor. Instead, you became exactly what you feared most, a monster willing to sacrifice everything for power." Adrian's response was wet gurgling that might have been curses or pleas. Then he stopped breathing and the silence became absolute. The king turned to Lucien and Duke Blackthorn. "I owe you an apology and explanation. When evidence of the Border Rebellion weapons conspiracy began circulating, I launched an investigation. What I discovered was that my nephew had been orchestrating attacks against you while using royal authority to legitimize his actions. So you came to stop him. I came to prevent civil war." King Edward's voice was heavy. Adrian's conspiracy had already fractured the kingdom. If I'd allowed him to execute you, the northern territories would have rebelled completely. The merchant guilds were preparing to withdraw support from the crown. Foreign powers were offering military aid to reform movements. He gestured at the carnage filling the great hall. "Your rebellion wasn't destroying the kingdom. It was forcing us to confront corruption we'd been ignoring for decades. And sometimes the only way to save something worth preserving is admitting when it's been broken and needs repair." Lucien studied the king's face for a long moment. Then he sheathed his sword and knelt formally. "Your Majesty." House Blackthorn submits to crown authority. Not because we were wrong to fight, but because you've proven yourself willing to enforce actual justice instead of convenient politics. King Edward extended his hand and pulled Lucien to his feet. "Rise, Duke Blackthorn. You and your wife have earned more than submission. You've earned the kingdom's gratitude for exposing corruption that would have destroyed us from within." He turned to address the assembled soldiers from both sides. "The fighting ends now. Prince Adrian's conspiracy is finished. House Blackthorn is cleared of all charges and restored to full authority over the northern territories. Anyone who participated in illegal attacks against the Duke will face trial. Everyone else returns to their posts with my acknowledgement that they were following orders they believed legitimate." The king's voice carried absolute authority that ended debate, and the rebellion that had nearly torn the kingdom apart dissolved into exhausted relief from people who were glad to stop killing each other. 3 days later, Seraphina stood on Ravenspire's battlements watching reconstruction crews repair the damaged eastern wall. The castle that had nearly fallen now crawled with workers rebuilding what warfare had destroyed. Lucien joined her carrying 2 cups of wine and looking more exhausted than she'd ever seen him. He handed her 1 cup and stood beside her watching the valley below where royal forces had assembled. They were leaving tomorrow, returning to the capital with Prince Adrian's body and stories about the rebellion that had forced the crown to confront its own corruption. "We survived." Seraphina's voice was quiet. "Actually survived. Barely." Lucien took a long drink. Another hour, and we'd have been overwhelmed. The king's timing was uncomfortably perfect. You think he waited deliberately? Let us bleed to prove a point? I think he needed to see if we'd actually fight, or surrender when pressed. Lucien's expression was unreadable. Needed to know if House Blackthorn was worth preserving, or just another ambitious noble house using crisis for advancement. And his conclusion? That we're dangerous but necessary. The Duke's voice held dark humor. Exactly the reputation my ancestors built. Strong enough to be useful, loyal enough to be trusted, ruthless enough to be feared. Is that what you want to be? Lucien was silent for a long moment. Then he set down his wine and turned to face her directly. No. What I want is to build something different. Learn to rule through actual partnership instead of fear. Create a territory where exposing corruption doesn't cost your life. And loyalty means something beyond blind obedience. He took her hand. You taught me that strength isn't just about being willing to destroy everything. Sometimes it's about being willing to admit when you were wrong and change anyway. My father ruled through brutality because he thought mercy was weakness. But watching you stand beside me during impossible odds made me realize the strongest thing I've ever done was letting myself care about someone enough that their survival mattered more than my pride. That's growth. That's terrifying. Lucien's expression was serious, because caring about people makes you vulnerable in ways violence never can. Creates weaknesses your enemies will exploit. Forces you to make choices between tactical advantage and protecting what matters. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. But I'd rather face that fear with you than spend the rest of my life safe and alone pretending I don't know what I'm missing. Serafina felt tears sting her eyes. Not from grief this time. From something that felt almost like hope. We're going to rebuild this territory, make it better than what we inherited. Yes. Lucien pulled her close. But first we're going to rest. Actually rest. Sleep in beds instead of armor. Eat food that isn't rations. Remember what peace feels like. How long has it been since you knew peace? The Duke considered the question seriously. I'm not sure I ever have. My entire life has been preparation for war or recovery from it. Even childhood was just training for survival. Then we learned together. Serafina rested her head against his chest. How to build instead of just defend. How to trust instead of just calculate. How to live instead of just survive. They stood together on the battlements watching the sun set over mountains that had witnessed House Blackthorn's near destruction and unexpected resurrection. Below them, workers rebuilt damaged walls. Around them, household staff returned to normal routines. Above them, storm clouds that had threatened destruction finally drifted beyond the horizon. And for the first time since Serafina's father died, she felt something that had been missing settle back into her chest. Not innocence. She'd lost that weeks ago watching people die for political conspiracies. But something close to purpose. The understanding that surviving wasn't enough if you didn't build something worth protecting with the life you'd fought so hard to keep. 2 weeks later, King Edward summoned them to the capital for formal proceedings. The trial of Prince Adrian's co-conspirators was public spectacle designed to demonstrate that crown justice applied even to nobility. 17 lords were stripped of titles and lands. 8 were executed for direct involvement in murders. The rest were exiled to territories so remote they'd never threaten the kingdom again. The evidence Brennan had died releasing was verified by royal archivists and entered into official records. The Border Rebellion weapons conspiracy became historical fact that schools would teach and scholars would study. And House Blackthorn was formally acknowledged as having exposed corruption at great personal cost rather than committed treason. The king held a private audience with Lucien and Serafina in the throne room empty of courtiers. Duke Blackthorn, Duchess Serafina. Edward's voice was tired. What you did nearly destroyed the kingdom, forced us to confront secrets we'd kept buried for decades, created instability that will take years to fully repair. He paused. But you also saved us from becoming exactly what Prince Adrian wanted, a tyranny hiding behind royal authority where power mattered more than justice. For that, you have my gratitude and the kingdom's debt. What does that mean practically? Lucien asked with characteristic bluntness. It means House Blackthorn receives full autonomy over the northern territories. No royal interference in your governance provided you maintain basic loyalty to the crown. It means financial compensation for the damages sustained during Adrian's attacks. And it means a seat on my personal council to ensure northern interests are represented properly. You're making us powerful enough to threaten you. I'm making you invested enough in the kingdom's success that rebellion serves no purpose." The king's expression was shrewd. "You're ruthless, Duke Blackthorn, but you're not insane. Give you legitimate authority and you'll use it to build something stable. That's better for everyone than forcing you into corners where violence becomes the only option." It was political calculation wrapped in acknowledgement. The king couldn't eliminate House Blackthorn without triggering the exact instability he was trying to prevent. So instead he was binding them to the crown through mutual interest rather than fear. And somehow that felt more honest than any alliance built on forced loyalty. "We accept." Lucian's voice was formal. "House Blackthorn pledges loyalty to crown and kingdom provided that loyalty is earned through just governance rather than demanded through authority. Fair enough?" King Edward stood. "Now go home and rebuild what was nearly destroyed, and try not to start any more rebellions unless absolutely necessary." They returned to Ravenspire 3 days later to find the castle restored and household staff preparing celebrations for the Duke and Duchess who'd survived impossible odds. The feast that night was nothing like their interrupted wedding reception. This was genuine joy from people who'd chosen to stand beside them during the darkest moments and lived to see victory. Serafina sat beside Lucien at the head table, watching servants who'd become friends and soldiers who'd become family celebrate survival with the kind of intensity that came from staring at death and walking away. Captain Morse approached midway through the feast, carrying a sealed letter. "Your Grace, this arrived from the Royal Archives. They found additional documents about your father's death." Serafina broke the seal with trembling hands and read quickly. The letter contained testimony from witnesses who'd seen Prince Adrian's agents poison Duke Vale, confirmation that her father had been murdered for discovering the weapons conspiracy, evidence that would have saved him if anyone had investigated properly. She'd known the truth for weeks, but having it confirmed officially made something crack inside her chest. Her father had died telling the truth, and she'd nearly died finishing what he'd started. But they'd won. Actually won. Exposed the conspiracy and forced the kingdom to acknowledge its own corruption. That should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt like exhaustion and relief and grief for everything that had been lost along the way. Lucien's hand covered hers. "You did it. Got justice for your father." "Justice." Serafina looked at the letter. "Is that what this is? He's still dead. Brennan is dead. Hundreds of soldiers died during the siege. The kingdom nearly tore itself apart." She set the letter down carefully. "I wanted to believe that exposing the truth would make it better, that justice would heal the wound. But all it did was prove that power only respects greater power, and the cost of fighting corruption is sometimes higher than staying silent. Then we make that cost mean something." Lucien's voice was quiet. "We rebuild this territory better than we inherited it. We prove that standing up to corruption doesn't have to end in tragedy. We become the example that shows the next generation it's possible to fight without losing everything. That's optimistic for you. I learned it from you." He pulled her close. "The woman who walked into my great hall refusing to lower her eyes, and taught me that strength isn't just about being willing to destroy everything. Sometimes it's about being willing to build something worth protecting." They sat together at the head table, surrounded by people who'd survived impossible odds and chosen to rebuild rather than retreat. And Serafina understood with absolute clarity that this was the final lesson. Victory wasn't about crushing your enemies. It wasn't about seizing power or claiming territory or forcing the world to acknowledge your strength. Victory was surviving long enough to learn from your mistakes. Building something better than what you'd inherited. Discovering that the strongest thing you could become wasn't the monster everyone feared, but the person willing to face that fear and change anyway. Her father had died fighting for truth. Brennan had died protecting allies. Hundreds of soldiers had died defending principles that mattered more than survival. And Serafina was still alive to make sure their deaths meant something. That was the weight she'd carry. The responsibility that came with surviving when others hadn't. But looking at Lucien beside her and the people gathered in celebration, she realized she didn't have to carry it alone. Partnership. That's what they'd built during 2 weeks of conspiracy and violence and impossible choices. Not romantic fantasy where everything worked out perfectly, but brutal honest alliance between two people who'd learned that the strongest thing they could do was trust each other enough to share the weight. 6 months later, Ravenspire had transformed. The damaged eastern wall had been rebuilt stronger than before. Villages that royal forces burned during their advance had been reconstructed with better infrastructure. Trade routes reopened, bringing prosperity that had been missing during years of political instability.
and Duke Lucian Blackthorn ruled through something other than fear alone.
He still made hard choices, still enforced laws with brutal efficiency when necessary, still carried the reputation of being the most dangerous man in the North. But now that danger was tempered with actual justice. Corrupt officials disappeared not through execution, but through trials that gave them chance to defend themselves. Taxes were redistributed to benefit the people paying them, instead of just funding military expansion. Disputes were settled through negotiation before they escalated to violence. The territory was still ruthless, but it was ruthless in service of something beyond just Lucien's survival. Serafina walked through the reconstructed villages, watching children play in streets that had been battlefields months ago. Merchant stalls sold goods without fear of arbitrary seizure. Farmers worked lands they actually owned instead of just sharecropped. Small changes, incremental improvements. But they mattered, because building civilization from the ashes of near destruction meant understanding that strength wasn't just about being willing to fight. It was about being willing to create something worth fighting for. She found Lucien in the castle library reviewing territorial reports. He looked up when she entered and smiled with the kind of genuine warmth she'd never seen during those first desperate weeks. The harvest reports look good. His voice held satisfaction. Better yields than we've seen in 5 years. That's what happens when farmers aren't constantly afraid their crops will be seized. Serafina moved to stand beside his desk. Turns out people work harder when they benefit from the effort. Revolutionary concept. Lucian's expression was wry. My father would have considered it dangerous weakness. Your father ruled during constant warfare. We have the luxury of peace. She touched his shoulder. That means we can afford to build instead of just defend. Peace. He considered the word carefully. I'm still not sure I know what that actually means. Every quiet moment feels like preparation for the next crisis. Then we learn together. Serafina pulled him to his feet. How to trust that not everything is threat. How to believe that building something good doesn't automatically invite destruction. Lucian wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her close. You've made me softer. No. She held his gaze. I've made you complete. There's difference between soft and human. Is there? Yes. Being human means acknowledging that power without purpose is just violence dressed up as authority. That controlling everything doesn't actually keep you safe. That the strongest thing you can do is admit when you need help. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I need help. I know. Serafina touched his scarred jaw. And I'm here. That's what partnership means. They stood together in the library, surrounded by books and territorial maps and the evidence of everything they'd built from the ruins of near destruction. Outside, Ravenspire thrived under leadership that had learned to balance ruthlessness with actual justice. Above them, clear skies stretched over mountains that had witnessed 4 centuries of House Blackthorn's survival and now prepared to witness its transformation. And for the first time since Lucien inherited his father's title, the Duke of Ravenspire felt something close to hope settle in his chest. Not naive optimism that everything would work out perfectly, but genuine belief that what they were building together mattered more than what they'd survived alone. That evening, they stood on the battlements watching the sun set over territories they'd nearly lost and managed to save. Serafina leaned against Lucien's chest, feeling his heartbeat steady against her back. Do you ever regret it? Any of it? Which part? Fighting the rebellion, nearly dying, discovering that survival sometimes costs more than you think you can pay? All of it. Lucien was silent for a long moment. Then, no, because regretting the choices that brought us here means regretting you. And I'd burn the kingdom down again rather than lose what we've built together. That's not healthy attachment. No. His arms tightened around her. But it's honest. And I've learned that honest attachment matters more than safe distance. Serafina turned in his arms to face him directly. I love you. Not because you're perfect or safe or anything resembling easy, but because you taught me that strength means being willing to change when change is necessary. Lucien kissed her with the kind of intensity that came from surviving impossible odds together and discovering that what waited on the other side was worth every sacrifice. When he finally pulled back, his expression held something she'd never seen during those first desperate weeks. Not the cold calculation of a battlefield commander. Not the ruthless certainty of a duke who ruled through fear. Just a man who'd learned that the strongest thing he'd ever done was letting himself be vulnerable enough to admit he needed someone beside him instead of behind him. They stood together on the battlements, watching stars emerge over mountains that had witnessed House Blackthorn's near destruction and unexpected resurrection. Below them, a territory rebuilt from ashes thrived. Around them, people who'd chosen loyalty over safety celebrated survival. Above them, the universe spun on, indifferent to human struggles but somehow still beautiful. And Lucian Blackthorn, Duke of Ravenspire, the most feared man in the Northern Territories, the commander who'd held impossible odds through sheer ruthless will, finally understood the lesson his father had been too broken to teach. Power didn't matter if you lost yourself getting it. Territory meant nothing if you became monster to hold it. And winning wasn't actually victory if you had to sacrifice everything worth protecting. True strength wasn't about being willing to destroy everything that threatened you. It was about being willing to build something worth defending, even when that meant admitting you couldn't do it alone. Seraphina had taught him that lesson. Standing in his great hall, refusing to lower her eyes, challenging his authority during impossible circumstances, choosing to stand beside him during the darkest moments when survival meant becoming exactly as ruthless as the world demanded. She'd become his partner, his equal, the one person in the kingdom he trusted completely. And that trust had transformed him from the monster everyone feared into someone capable of actually leading instead of just dominating. The Northern Territories would remember this era, would tell stories about the Duke who'd nearly been destroyed by royal conspiracy and somehow survived to build something better than what he'd inherited, would speak of the Duchess who'd stood beside him when everyone else ran, who'd fought and bled and refused to break even when the entire kingdom turned against them, would understand that sometimes the greatest act of strength wasn't winning every battle. It was surviving long enough to learn from your mistakes and build something worth protecting with the life you'd fought so hard to keep. And in quiet moments, decades from now, when students studied the Border Rebellion and its aftermath, they would learn about House Blackthorn's transformation, how a territory built on fear and ruthlessness learned to balance power with actual justice, how a duke who'd spent his entire life learning to dominate discovered that partnership mattered more than control, how a woman seeking justice for her murdered father became the catalyst that forced an entire kingdom to confront its own corruption. The story would be incomplete, would miss nuance and complexity, would simplify messy reality into clean narrative, but the core truth would remain, that sometimes survival required becoming ruthless, that exposing corruption cost more than you thought you could pay, that fighting for what mattered meant accepting consequences you'd never fully escape, but also that change was possible, that people could grow beyond what trauma had made them, that strength meant being willing to admit when you needed help, and that love, real love, not romantic fantasy, but brutal, honest partnership between equals, could transform monsters into something approaching human. Lucian held Seraphina close on the battlements of Ravenspire Castle and understood with absolute clarity that this was victory. Not defeating every enemy, not claiming every territory, not becoming so powerful that nothing could threaten you, but surviving long enough to discover what you were actually fighting for. And building something worth protecting with the person who'd taught you that strength came in forms you'd never been allowed to imagine. The stars wheeled overhead, the mountains stood eternal, and House Blackthorn began its slow transformation from legacy of brutality into something that might actually deserve the loyalty it demanded. The journey would be long, the changes incomplete. The struggle never truly over, but for the first time in 4 centuries, Ravenspire's rulers understood that true power came not from being feared, but from being worth following even when following meant sacrifice. And that made all the difference.